It was a time of chaos when the ancient enemy had one goal in mind: to destroy the remaining cities and to destroy the people of Tartaria, of the Fourth Era civilization that preceded ours, once and for all, this final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets. What became of the defense forces of these civilizations, those charged with its defense? Was it lost forever, or was there some trace of them, some lineage that continues to this day? Join us for today's exploration as we seek to answer the questions of what happened to Tartaria's defense forces. Did they survive? The compelling mystery of what became of the defense forces of Tartaria is something that we've looked into before, but today we're going to be examining the account of the monastic military orders of the Middle Ages. We'll be looking at the Knights of Santiago subsequently when we explore the Iberian Peninsula. We begin by examining the Teutonic Order. Interestingly enough, all these military orders that we're examining were affiliated with the Catholic Church, and they followed the First Crusade, the military effort to reconquer Jerusalem from the Saracens at the time, according to the official history. All of these military orders then rose afterwards, and we examine the Teutonic Knights because they are affiliated with the German Order of St. Mary, interestingly enough. And all these military orders were originally founded, and yes, that word was used, in order to protect the pilgrims that were coming from Europe to visit the Holy Land in Jerusalem. At least that was their ostensible purpose. And when we examine each of these military orders, we find that there are many incredible, and what we would define as old world structures, that are affiliated or attributed to these military orders. It's rather intriguing, though, to think that there was a time, beginning with the Teutonic Knights, that the Church would actually sanction a military order, an almost independent military order that had the permission and even a charter from the Church to conduct military operations. And indeed, the Teutonic Knights, despite being founded in what is today the Middle East, operated extensively within Europe. And there were several chapters, several members, and several different hierarchies concerning the Teutonic Knights. It's also intriguing to think of this Germanic culture that existed even before Germany was a nation. The Teutonic Knights were most operational in Prussia, and indeed, many of the Grand Masters sought permission from the Church and even from the Holy Roman Empire, that was de facto Germany at that time, although really a collection of loose kingdoms, to conduct this crusade, to convert the pagans of Prussia to Catholicism. And indeed, that's the recurring theme that we have with these military orders, although they have different specific histories. Now, do we take the history at face value, or is it possible that there is an entirely different account with these military orders? Were the Teutonic Knights really knights that just simply came from what is today Germany, even though it was the Holy Roman Empire at that time? Or do they have a very different origin? Indeed, they continued campaigning in what is today Eastern Europe until they were defeated in what is historically known as the Battle of Tannenberg, and it has many other names to it, in which case a alliance of Polish and Lithuanian forces defeated the Teutonic Knights, and eventually their financial ruin came about. The order did survive, and as stated before, there are many structures that are attributed to it. But what's intriguing is that the order survived and converted to a holy order alone in the early 1800s. Ah yes, once again, something else attributed to the 1800s. And here in this image we see the order campaigning for approval from the Holy Roman Empire to begin to convert the pagans of Prussia at that time to Catholicism. And that's the historical account of it. The order was defeated in the Battle of Tannenberg, and over time their power waned. But again, it's intriguing to think of this concept from the official history of a military order that was charged to conduct their own operations, and given autonomy and independence to do so, apparently as long as they were doing so in the name of the Church. It's also interesting when you think about the stated reason, or at least the historically agreed upon reason for the Crusades being started. There's also many prominent politicians, such as the former Chancellor of West Germany, who were honorary members of the current Teutonic Order. Of course, that's in its present state. And something else we'll look at is how these particular orders evolved. There's also the mystery of Malbork Castle, built sometime between 1274 and 1406 in what is today Poland. This was considered the grand fortress of the Teutonic Knights. And of course, records don't indicate who actually built it. Scholars and historians actually have to extrapolate from financial statements and what little historical record we have to indicate that the Teutonic Knights were even the ones who built this incredible structure. And it should be noted that it is the largest castle by area in the world. What else would it be? And it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But for the longest time, it was the main base of operations and the headquarters of this order, if you will, in Europe. And looking closely at this castle, we'll see that there are many impressive signs of old world architecture. There's also very unique and interesting symbols. Now, of course, we could say that these symbols could all be stated to be the heraldry of the Teutonic Order at that time in the Middle Ages. But when you look a little bit more closely, you see that there tends to be more symbols. You also see a very interesting architecture behind this particular structure. This castle, this fortress, this citadel, whatever you want to call it, seems to have many incredible geometrically precise construction techniques and details on the exterior and the interior. Indeed, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a structure that was actually constructed in the 1800s, especially with all the elaborate brickwork. And it is rather peculiar that, much like many other structures, they do actually admit, they being historians and scholars, that there is no written record of who actually built this very impressive castle. There is no shortage of statues and other figures affiliated with it that give us the impression that yes, this was very much a castle of the Teutonic Knights, and then subsequently given to Poland after the defeat in the Battle of Tannenberg. But what's the true account behind it? Was this really a structure that was built by this monastic military order? Or is there something else behind it? Is it possible that instead of this military order being some order that was founded in the Middle East, that originally its origin was in what is today Europe? That quite possibly it was a surviving military force, or even a particular military unit that happened to be operating within this area when the reset happened. And that the structure that they were operating in, this very impressive castle, that is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, actually has a very different origin. That it was in fact either their headquarters of their unit, or possibly some structure that survived the reset, and then this military unit decided to inhabit, and this is where their operations began. Now granted, this is speculation, and it's theory, but once again, what makes more sense? Are we to simply accept the official historical account that this very elaborate spiral stairway was constructed by someone unknown who was in the employ of the Teutonic Knights during a time frame when such constructions were very difficult? Indeed, we haven't really even entered the Renaissance. This castle also has no shortage of very impressive artifacts within it. And what's the true account within these artifacts? We'll have to do a follow-up exploration examining many of these wonderful artifacts that still survive in these incredible cathedrals and these castles. And indeed, the surrounding towns around this castle in Poland are just as impressive, showing advanced and detailed architecture, something that we don't really see attempted today. Of course, we have the usual reasons for why this is. We lack funds, there's safety standards, and it just doesn't make sense to construct buildings like this that have an artistic appeal. It makes more sense to build things that are simply functional. And those may all be true. But why is it we constantly see this pattern repeated everywhere we go? And we're also going to have to do a follow-up exploration of Poland, in addition to our explorations that are planned for the Iberian Peninsula. There are many incredible structures that we haven't looked at yet. And whether it's in Poland or Spain or examining the accounts of these castles, we do see the same precision, the same detailing of the architecture. Constructed at a time when there was no mechanization, there was no motorization, logistics were very problematic. And even though they had more time in Europe, at least according to the official history, there are many details of it that seem to defy the ability of the logistics available at the time to explain. Indeed, you look at the foundation stones of this particular tower, and the arrangement of the blocks over the door, and we've seen these patterns before. Many of the great forts in the United States, and across the Caribbean and many other areas of the land. What was the real purpose behind this tower? Was this yet another defensive tower? And are we really to accept that this impressive castle of Malbork was constructed simply for defensive reasons? There's many artistic elements within it. Why would a monastic military order, charged in the middle of conquering, or subduing, however you want to say it, these Prussian pagans that were in existence at the time, according to the official historical account, want to build a castle that has such devotions to both art and even a religious fervor to it? Well, the religious fervor is easily explained, and of course we even have cannons in the courtyard of this castle. Ah yes, where do we go without our wonderful cannons? And look at the courtyard and the stones that's actually made up. Looking at elsewhere in the interior, we'll see the examples of arches and columns, and even an impressive tiled floor to go along with all the bricks. Again, one could be forgiven for mistaking this incredible castle for being built in the 1800s. And once again, we see that very unique and impressive checkerboard floor. So why are we focusing on this one particular structure? According to the official history, we don't know who actually built it. And we certainly know that Gordon Ramsay wasn't around to design and architect this impressive kitchen, although they certainly must have had a cook like him who could prepare their fine meals. It's also interesting when we think about the fact that the monastic military orders were all founded on the principle of piety, but also chastity, and finally, poverty. And yet, the remains of these military orders suggest anything but poverty. They seem to be very materially well off, again looking at the official historical account. But if we consider other theories of their origin, if we consider the fact that these actually were established units, or at least the successors of established units of the defense forces of Tartaria, then suddenly we have an entirely different explanation that makes a lot more sense. We have the existence and the presence of these structures with their fine geometric precision, who no doubt had more advanced capabilities of construction, and undoubtedly had a very advanced logistical system. It's that advanced logistical system that we oftentimes don't even consider, and people who defend the mainstream never even address. Now, it's not to say that it could not have been completed or done, as we're told in the official historical account. However, looking at things objectively, it seems very unlikely that given the logistical capabilities at the time, they could have actually even assembled all of these construction materials. There's also the fact that this impressive castle, if it is indeed hundreds of years old, and for all we know it could be much older, is still standing to this day. And how many structures are we building now that will still be standing even 100 years from now? I'll leave that question to you. Looking elsewhere in the details of the castle, we see many icons and symbols that we've seen in other locations, and of course not just in Germany or Poland. Poland is also quite interesting as a nation because of its rather unique status, and even looking in more recent history with things that developed with Poland concerning the Second World War. But looking across the cathedrals and in the castle, you'll see that there are many design elements that are overlapping with other incredible structures that we've looked at. I'm trying to imagine a limited group of Teutonic knights walking through this impressive castle. Who exactly did build it if we take the historical account at face value? Where did they find these impressive architects? And even the architects, who are not documented at all in this particular account, who actually built it? And how did they go about building it? And what was its true intention and purpose? Because it seems rather hard to believe that it was simply constructed for defensive purposes. Indeed, it seems to have many other uses as an overall structure, and no doubt it did. And some of these artifacts, which we can of course attribute to the religious foundation of the Catholicism of these military orders, is it possible that there's another explanation for the origin of these unique artifacts? And indeed, looking elsewhere across the nearby communities in Poland, we do see other great towers with elaborate brickwork and windows within them. Yes, of course, you could say that these are for defensive purposes, but then you look elsewhere across the town and you see a little bit more of an artistic flair. You see the same design elements that we've seen in other places that we've looked at. Now, there are many defenders of the mainstream narrative who will simply say that this was merely medieval masonry construction. And I suppose the statues were just as easy to do at that time as well, because everybody lived so well during that time frame. Of course, there's always the conflicting account between how difficult things really were. When you look at nearby cathedrals to Malbork Castle, you'll also see a similarity in the construction, and indeed the piety that seemed to be readily apparent, at least according to the official account. But looking at Malbork Castle, you can see that there's much more than just simply a defensive fortification in mind when it was constructed. There's elaborate constructions that show many arches, many geometric precisions, and even decorations that endure to this day. Now I have to ask the question, in reality, how many times has this structure been renovated? What was its actual origin? And what are the purposes of these columns here? It's almost as though someone was trying to show what they could really do at that time. We also have the many statues and reliefs that are seen across the castle. And once again, we almost get the indication of something a little bit more advanced than what we might expect to see, whether it's in the construction itself or what it's actually depicting. We, of course, have no shortage of old sketches or drawings of the castle and how it looked in its fullness of glory. It's quite intriguing to me that this castle managed to survive 2 world wars and many other destructive events over time. And what exactly do these iron figures here in this courtyard represent? What exactly are they displaying from the era of the Teutonic Knights? Were they added later? Who really constructed them? And what are they really telling us? Are these the unfortunate individuals that originally constructed the castle? What exactly is being displayed here? And by all means, let me know what you think in the comments. Looking elsewhere in the castle, we'll find more of the icons and symbols that we might be more expected to see, showing the armored knight on horseback, and oddly enough showing the interesting headgear, which does endure to this day with the official uniform of these military orders. And naturally we would have a depiction of a gargoyle or a demonic figure to be found in this castle, this pious castle that was constructed by a monastic military order. We go to the military order of the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, or as they're more commonly known as the Knights Hospitaller, founded in the early 1100s, as opposed to the Teutonic Knights who were founded in the later 1100s. And they even have as a secondary symbol the Great Maltese Cross. Of course, when we look at these symbols of these ancient military orders, and really we have to say they're ancient because by official history they're hundreds of years old, what's their origin? When we look at depictions and accounts of the Knights Hospitaller, though, we tend to find some conflicting accounts. There's also the fact that the Knights Hospitaller was involved in several significant military campaigns. And even in this particular depiction, there's some rather odd figures. What exactly is going on here with these particular animals? And what are these orders Grand Masters really doing? We have this depiction of one of the great knights of the Knights Hospitaller in a military campaign, but when we look down towards the bottom of it, we see a particular individual who appears to be suffering for some unknown reason. We have the military campaigns, such as the Siege of Rhodes, in which the Knights Hospitaller managed to withstand a siege by the Ottoman Turks at that time, a siege in which they were vastly outnumbered. There's numerous other military confrontations that they were involved in. Now, once again, stepping back and looking at the greater picture, could it be possible that this Knights Hospitaller was yet another unit of the original defense forces of Tartaria that somehow survived? Indeed, many allusions to the Knights Hospitaller survive to this day, and they're also prominently active on Malta. Yes, Malta, that very unique and interesting island in the middle of the Mediterranean that we've explored before, with its incredible star forts, and of course they have a incredible bombard that they used to defend during one of the sieges from the Ottomans. It's also the classic underdog story that the Knights Hospitaller was able to withstand these sieges from these vast military forces that the Ottoman Empire was to bring to bear against it. Of course, that's the official history. Could it have been, though, that these military orders, these descendants, or somehow connected to the lineage of Tartaria's original defense forces, had an entirely different purpose. And over time, after reset, they had to establish their own purpose. They either tried to survive against the forces of the reset, or they had to capitulate and operate within. There's also the interesting comparison, or even the opposite mentality, between the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, right down to the coloring and the red cross on black field and the red cross on white field. Does it symbolize something? Could there be a different account with these particular orders? Or does it once again show the entire dichotomy, the duality that seems to be a primary feature of our current civilization? When you look at the military efforts of the Knights Hospitaller, you will see that oftentimes it was many of these sieges that occurred within the Mediterranean, and oftentimes the valor of these knights were critical to retaining possessions within the Mediterranean. There's also the fact that there are current modern members and that this order survives to this day, and people who still wear its icons and its uniforms. Quite an interesting consideration. We go from the Knights Hospitaller to the Knights Templar, and there's no more greater controversy than examining the account of the Knights Templar. Of the military orders that we're looking at today, the Knights Templar is the only military order that did not officially survive to the contemporary time frame. Now, it should be noted that there are many present-day organizations that claim a lineage or descendants from the Knights Templar. But is that true? Even looking at some of the original depictions, we have conflicts in terms of what uniforms they wore. It's also noted that the Knights Templar were featured as the frequent antagonists of many fictional works, all the way from the works of Walter Scott to Ridley Scott to this day. Quite an interesting consideration when you look at it. The Knights Templar met with a very undignified and horrifying end, when its order was rejected by the Catholic Church, and at the urging of King Philip of France, their members were burned at the stake. Indeed, the order was completely destroyed. This being the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, displayed right here, Jacques du Molay, who in the early 1300s, along with many prominent members of the rest of the order, were officially put to death. Now, is this exactly what happened in history? That an entire monastic military order was accused of heresy by a king? A monastic military order that apparently had more authority. Indeed, there is the requisite plaque that is dedicated to Jacques de Molay in Paris to this day. So what exactly happened? Why do we have these conflicting accounts with the Knights Templar? Why is it there are some that say that they were a force for good? And remember, all of these monastic military orders were originally founded to protect pilgrims. And yet, as stated earlier, when you look at fictional works such as the stories of Robin Hood, or even to this day the modern Kingdom of Heaven, the Knights Templar are always depicted as antagonists. Were they evil? Were they a corrupted force from the original defense forces of Tartaria? There's also the references that the Knights Templar were the Knights of the Dome, or Knights of the Round, even affiliations and references to King Arthur. They were present at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, which was a decisive defeat when the forces of the Saracens defeated the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the major military orders, at least again according to the official history. But once again, is there a very different account? Why is it that there are so many references to the Knights Templar that exist to this day? Remember that there officially is not a direct lineage from the Knights Templar that survived. The order was all killed in the early 1300s. And yet, for whatever reason, we are informed that the symbols and the icons of the order are still prominently displayed on many of the successor organizations that continue to this day. Successor organizations that proudly display these icons. Are they the same icons, or is there some other account behind this? And again, not knowing the true nature. Even looking at the recent TV show Robin of Sherwood, there's a prominent early first season episode called 7 Poor Knights of Acre, where Robin Hood is nearly killed by the Knights Templar and has to face off against 7 members of their order. Indeed, the entire conflict is started because the Knights Templar are trying to recover a material item, very different than their poor knights mentality. There's even an infamous line between the sheriff and the Knights Templar where the sheriff says he represents the king, and the Knights Templar respond by saying they represent the King of Kings. So how exactly was it then that a king of France was able to get this entire order excommunicated and deposed by the church? It seems to be a conflicting account. And yet when you look into the original account of the Knights Templar, there's nothing but conflicting accounts. The fact that apparently they evolved from being a very pious and very poor military force, founded to protect pilgrims, that ended up becoming one of the early, if not the earliest, bankers of Europe. Yes, all this is attributed to the Knights Templar. Now, is this true? Is this the original Knights Templar? Or was the order that was completely put to death and destroyed in the 1300s, or whatever time frame it really was, actually the original military defense force that did survive, and that the use and the references to the order is merely a corruption, or perhaps a means of showing a victory over a force that was found to be in conflict with the current powers that be? It's really hard to say. There's many possibilities. We don't know the exact allegiance or what really happened. It could well be that the Knights Templar that were put to death really were the corrupt villains that we often see depicted in fiction. Or it could be that there is something to be stated for the original pious and poor means that these knights had. It's always been one of the details I've found interesting about the account of the Templars, and indeed the other monastic military orders, is the fact that they were stated to take a vow of poverty. And yet we have accounts of this great Templar fleet that roamed the Mediterranean and caused a lot of different issues. Indeed, there are still references in the accounts of the U.S. Navy that talk about the lineage of this Templar fleet, although some argue if it ever indeed existed. It's quite fascinating to consider the many conflicting accounts of the Knights Templar. We have one account that they really were the great knights of old, much in the same vein as Arthur's knights, that put the concept of chivalry at the highest, and the basic form of chivalry, which was protecting those that could not defend themselves. Indeed, we see this in the baseline values of these military orders. And we even see this in this depiction of the two Knights Templars riding one horse, because they lacked the money to purchase more horses. We also look at their very terrifying end, the official historical account which says that the entire order was destroyed, every member hunted down. There are some accounts, and indeed they're conflicting, that other orders did bring in the surviving members of the Knights Templar, such as the Teutonic Knights, again indicating more of a relationship, despite the fact that there's many years between their official founding. And again, there's still many impressive structures that endure to this day, and whether you want to think of them as churches or fortifications, or both, fortifications with chapels, they do again show the very impressive signs of elaborate and advanced construction. And indeed, when we look closely at many of the fortresses that are attributed to the Knights Templar, we'll find this advanced Gothic construction, as they call it. And is that all it is? Or does it have some other application? And indeed, is it the same account as the Castle of Malbork for the Teutonic Knights, that this was simply the structure that they occupied? I even think of the film Ice Pirates, which refers to evil Templars from the planet Mithra. So we can even go to science fiction, and in this case a comical science fiction film, where we still have this legacy of the Templars being evil. It even says so in the opening crawl. And in the film they're depicted as being science fiction medieval knights, if you will, comically so. But if you pay a lot of attention to the actual costumes, and indeed some of the symbols of the costume, you find that there seems to be something else that's indicated. And it's a wonderful chance to see a very cheesy early 80s film, or more mid-80s film, with Robert Urich as one of the Ice Pirates. Also very interesting, considering the affiliation of Templars with pirates. But then, they're not the pirates? And indeed, as we said, there are many organizations that still display the symbols of the Templars, and indeed claim that they have a modern affiliation with the Templars, which is fascinating given the fact that the Knights Templar was completely destroyed. So is that really the account that's going on? Or is it simply a means of showing respect? But why would anybody show respect to an order that was excommunicated and ordered destroyed by the church. And finally, we look at the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. The Order of the Holy Sepulchre is probably the most intriguing. It's also officially the oldest, founded by Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the central leaders of the First Crusade in 1099. The order endures to this day and indeed seems to have the largest official membership. It's facilitated by the Pope himself. We also have this depiction of King Baldwin IV wearing the symbols of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Baldwin the Leper King, portrayed by Edward Norton in the film Kingdom of Heaven, and quite well. We look at many of the structures of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, considered to be the most holy site by many within all of Catholic Christianity, and indeed other sects of Christianity. Of course, there are diverging views, but it is safe to say that this has always been a very important location. What was the reality, though, behind this particular order? And what happened with it? Why does once again we seem to have these conflicting accounts of what these orders actually did? Was it founded to protect pilgrims reaching the Holy Land? Was it founded to protect these very religious structures that have the affiliation with the trials and tribulations of the life of Jesus Christ himself? We even have early floor plans of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Do they represent something else? And is it possible that this structure might be a lot older than we could begin to imagine? I've oftentimes suspected that the baseline or the guidelines of the major monotheistic religions, and indeed all the other religions across the land, do have a lot of truth in them, and that they may have an origin that is far older than we can begin to imagine. But it's also suffice to say that many of these orders, no doubt, have been changed over time. How much of their original purpose endures to this day? You will find that this particular symbol comes up a lot along many holy books and many references to Jerusalem, and it indeed does represent the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. But is there another account behind it? We oftentimes think about these references that each of these military orders have to the original Knights of the Round Table, or Knights of the Round, such as the Knights Templar. You'll also find that there are no shortage of fine burial arrangements for former members of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. And quite fascinating that this order is still dominated by the Catholic Church to this day, with the Pope officially as the head of it. And then we have these old images of Jerusalem from the 1800s, and it already does look like it's been around for hundreds or thousands of years, and indeed it does conform to our expectations. We're going to have to do an exploration of Jerusalem at some point in time, and really look at the origin of some of these impressive structures. These are considered to be the most holy sites for the three major monotheistic religions in the land. But is there another account behind these structures? Did something behind these religions actually originate within the city of Jerusalem that's far beyond our current understanding? Or is it simply all as written between these different religions? This is referred to as Christian graffiti that's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Very interesting looking graffiti, and I find it fascinating that they refer to it as such. Is it possible, though, beyond all of these religious origin stories and these accounts of piety, that these orders actually have a different history than we could ever begin to imagine? That they are, in fact, the surviving military units of Tartaria's defense forces, the forces that did manage to survive the reset. Perhaps they took refuge in these incredible old world structures that for whatever reason were impervious to the effects of the reset. Perhaps they were simply trying to survive the forces that were trying to hunt them down and destroy them. Or it could be an entirely different account, that after the reset these orders eventually declined and fell into corruption. And indeed, many of what we see with the ideals, the values of these orders being corrupted over time is a recurring theme. Originally, they were founded with the order of chastity, piety, and poverty. Yet, suddenly they gave themselves to material wealth. Looking in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we see the very depiction of Jesus Christ himself. And yet a very interesting artistic depiction, especially when you pay attention to things such as the fingers. Is it possible that there's something else being alluded to in this beyond the divinity associated with Jesus Christ? What exactly is the art in this mosaic referring to? And is there another connection with these military orders that we cannot even begin to imagine? Indeed, we see the same signs of what we might think of as divine architecture, with the geometric precision and even the various incredible lighting behind it. There's no doubt that it may be the piety is quite real, that the religious and spiritual connection is quite real. Or it could also be possible that there is a much more complex and very unique explanation to understanding the true account of these military orders than we like to believe. It's also fascinating to me that once again we have Pope Alexander VI involved in this. And we've looked at Pope Alexander VI before. He was a graduate of the University of Bologna. What are the odds of that? All these things seem to come together when you actually study history, and in a way that doesn't seem to be easy to explain. Now, these connections would be explainable if perhaps the history was connected, or dare I say, even studied and then brought to a point where things might overlap a little bit more than they're supposed to. Perhaps that's what we have going on with this account of these orders, and why we have so many conflicting accounts with their origin. And of course, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you again have these very unique and intriguing items, these most holy religious items. Is there something more behind them? Do they have a greater power that's beyond spiritual power? This is Edwin O'Brien, current Cardinal and former Archbishop of the Military Services of the United States. And he's also a member of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, isn't that interesting? The Military Services of the United States having an archdiocese. Now, of course, on the surface, that would not be too alarming or questionable because the military still has its chaplain corps. And of course, the chaplain corps encompasses many different faiths. Of course, I find it interesting looking at this image of American service members actually being preached to while they have their weapons up on the wall. Now, is there anything alarming about that? No, it's just there's something that it reminds me of in the past. The past of having these monastic military orders that we're looking at in this exploration being preached to by members of the church hierarchy. And indeed, this particular individual who was the archbishop. It's also fascinating when you think of the other connections of the United States military, such as its ongoing presence within Europe that continues to this day, United States European Command, which is the major component command that has always been present within Europe since World War II, originally headquartered here in the IG Farben building. There's also the concept of the fact that the United States is the only nation whose military divides up all of the geographical areas of the known land into military areas of responsibility. And European Command is the major combatant command that is responsible for all of Europe, which also just happens to include the entire area of Russia. But back to the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, you can find that there are still many members that are active to this day who wear the icons and the symbols and the rather unique uniforms, if you will, of this particular order. Again, is this alluding to something? And indeed, this order has survived from its founding to today. There was never a time of purging or destruction. But we have to ask the question, why is it that these orders endure to this day? Why are they venerated in such a manner? And did the orders originally survive? You can even wear some pretty fancy uniforms if you're a member of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Or if you're one of the other current organizations that claims to have a lineage from one of these original holy orders. So what's the connection? Is this an actual connection? Or is this merely a display of trophies, if you will? A defeat or a victory of these original orders? It's hard to know what the history is really about, and of course after seeing these uniforms I realized I was probably a little too critical of the uniforms that were shown in Dune the miniseries on the Sci-Fi Channel. I always thought the Sardaukars headgear looked a little, well, silly, but now I'm reevaluating it. I also think of the connection of the Brotherhood of Steel, from the Fallout series. Going back to the original 2 games, the Brotherhood of Steel was actually descended from a U.S. Army unit that had survived the Great War, or the nuclear exchange, or the reset event, if you will, in the Fallout universe. That they preserved technology and gradually evolved into an entirely new organization, a Brotherhood of Steel. Indeed, their original leader was depicted as being Captain John Maxon, a U.S. Army captain who was rather abhorred by the actions that the scientists in the facility that he was charged with protecting were committing against innocent individuals. And he took matters into his own hands and killed the scientists. Now, of course, you could argue that there'd be no modern military officer who would do a thing like this. It might be bad for his officer evaluation. But the entire concept, though, of a military unit that had been descended and then evolved after a reset event taken from the Brotherhood of Steel seems to apply to what we're looking at for these monastic military orders. But as always, the official history could be true. Again, it just doesn't seem to be likely that every single detail of it is true, and maybe significant portions of it have been altered. But what are your thoughts? What do you think about the military orders? Are they the remnants of the Defense Forces of Tartaria? And why all the connections to this day? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Ruins across the landscape that give us clues that there was a once great civilization that encompassed the entire world. The civilization that we refer to as Tartaria. The civilization that preceded ours. And while we may not know its actual name or what language they spoke, we know that this civilization existed, found in the wondrous ruins that dot the landscape. Indeed, many still in use today by our current civilization. But how did this wondrous civilization fall? What was the final chapter in its true history? Today we are going to explore that when we look at the final conflict of Tartaria. The legacy of Gog-Magog, Tartaria's final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets, and then the civilization had to begin again. Were these natural disasters, or were these artificially induced disasters that destroyed these civilizations? In the 4th era Tartarian civilization, we see that it had 3 phases, a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline and a fall. During its ascendancy, we believe that it won a great conflict against some unknown external enemy. We've posited at the locations and origins of this potential enemy. Yet in this exploration, we're going to consider the final conflict that Tartaria faced, which brought about the downfall of this wondrous civilization, the civilization that managed to build incredible structures all across the land, cities that were built on top of the ruins of previous civilizations that we call the Foundation Eras. The Five Eras theory explains the fact that we do have deep structures with many foundations and many structures that are built on top of the remnants of previous structures. But there may have been many more eras. Indeed, the many memorials that we see across the land. Were these really memorials to national achievements, as we're told, great conflicts that we know of in our official history? Or are the other symbols that we see that don't make sense to us representative of something else? A great victory that Tartaria won in its first conflict during its civilization. Perhaps that explains why we see all these discrepancies with what we would think of as Civil War monuments or other great conflicts that we're told of in our history. Memorials that were simply repurposed and redesigned to reflect the achievement of Tartaria. And yet, Tartaria faced an adversary that it could not possibly overcome. The legacy of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog. It has a biblical reference to it, although, oddly enough, it appears in multiple religions, mythology, or official history, or scriptures, or whatever you want to call them. Gog-Magog represents an evil force, originally referring to 2 individuals, and yet in many of the maps of the Mappamundi and the history of the Middle Ages, we're told that Gog-Magog represented an entire force of individuals. Perhaps it was this sort of external threat that faced Tartaria that they were unable to contend with. Or maybe it refers to the fact that many individuals within their own defense forces, this civilization's great leaders, who were corrupted or subverted by the external forces that had somehow been unleashed on their civilization. Or perhaps it was merely the same adversary that Tartaria's predecessors had faced, and now they had returned to exact their revenge on the people of Tartaria. Initially, their first conflict was unsuccessful. The unified peoples of Tartaria were unable to be overcome. Therefore, this invasion force, this external threat, had to change their tactics. And we have accounts of Gog-Magog being people who were completely and totally uncivilized, and perhaps not even human beings in many ways, shapes, or forms. We even have accounts that they were individuals who were cannibals and did not recognize the precepts of society. Whatever the reality is, we have many maps from the Middle Ages that indicate that the invaders of Gog-Magog were confined to a particular geographical area. And indeed, the residents and the denizens of Tartaria were threatened, as it seems as though these ruthless attackers were unrelenting in their efforts to completely destroy the people. But we just don't know if this was simply an external threat or if this was something that attacked Tartaria from two sides, externally and internally, as we do have accounts of individuals who were corrupted by the influences of Gog-Magog. There's also the account of Alexander the Great, the hero, at least the hero when it comes to contending with the threat of Gog-Magog. Gog-Magog, the nation with uncivilized individuals that was destroying all the other civilized peoples of the world at that time. And maybe Alexander the Great represents Belisarius and Lucius Aurelian, leaders who we're told have a place in history, but may in fact have been the final leaders of the great Tartarian civilization, trying to defend it from the unrelenting attacks from the threat of Gog-Magog. Many of the maps that we have from the Middle Ages, or the Mappa Mundi, indicate that the threat of Gog-Magog was confined to a geographical area. They were trapped by walls and natural terrain features that were reinforced by obstacles. There are many different biblical references from both Christianity and Islam that indicate the actions of Alexander the Great and the threat faced by Gog-Magog. Very odd for something that only came from one particular area of the land, that it's referenced by multiple civilizations and multiple religions in our current civilization, giving the indication that perhaps there's a lot more to these origin stories and this threat of Gog-Magog than simple mythology or simple fantasy. When we look at many of the images in the accounts, we see various efforts by the people led by Alexander, the remnants of the Tartarian civilization, to attempt to safeguard their civilization by building walls and building forts and building outposts that would survive this attack. What we don't know is if this attack from Gog-Magog came before or after what we consider the Great Reset event. There might have been a series of disasters that befell Tartaria, and they turned to their final great commanders to try to defend and safeguard their civilization. We know that their efforts failed over time, and yet we still have the remnants of their fortifications. We're told of great walls built across the land, and indeed the Gates of Alexander, which exists to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, may have been an attempt to try to forestall this attack, this invasion by these forces of Gog-Magog, this nation that had no civilized rules, that seemed to be unrelenting in its efforts to destroy the people of Tartaria. And when we look at the maps that we have, we can even find the natural passes through the mountains of the Caucasus. We're told that the Gates of Alexander fall right here, where there's reinforcing fortifications on the natural mountain passes. Although for all we know, perhaps the original mountains themselves may not be quite as natural as we're led to believe. When we study more of the maps of the advances of the individuals of Gog-Magog, or this terrifying nation, or whatever this external threat truly was, we can see that the walls were not successful in keeping them contained. That eventually, according to subsequent maps, they spread across the entire land, destroying every civilization that came in their way. And indeed, we do have historical accounts that try to relate this to other nations that we're told were simple hordes that crossed the land. It wasn't just the Mongols, it was also the many other forces of the Huns and the barbarian invasions. Perhaps all these refer to the same force, the original force of Gog-Magog, simply being hidden at different points in our history, with different individuals all referring to the same event. Perhaps the great leader Alexander the Great, whatever his name really was also corrupted by this influence. We have accounts and images that show Alexander the Great even working with the devil, or at least the forces of evil, to try to contain these forces of Gog-Magog. Perhaps he fell to the corruption and the influence that had overcome many of the leaders of Tartaria, and this led to the unfortunate fall and total destruction of their civilization. After they were hit by the natural disaster, or perhaps it was an artificially induced disaster, they were left at the mercy of these relentless forces of Gog-Magog. This would explain these isolated monasteries that we have, and what we view as reset compounds. Perhaps they were also survival compounds, the last-ditch attempt by a civilization that could see its end rapidly coming, trying to preserve anything and everything that they could of their civilization, their society, their true history, all that they had learned, even their architectural capabilities. And yet we know that very little of the previous civilization managed to reach ours. Indeed, to even question its existence is oftentimes ridiculed. But we can look at these subsequent maps and we can see that the remaining people of the world were the ones who were waiting for their final destruction, that the efforts of Alexander or whoever the commanders were had failed, that Gog-Magog had succeeded in utterly destroying the Fourth Era civilization, or at least completing its destruction. Where do all these origin stories derive from? If we consider the Olympic opening ceremony at the Olympics in Sochi in 2014 in Russia, perhaps we have a depiction of the actual account of the fall of this civilization that preceded ours, that we call Tartaria on our channel. Now, why would we have clues that are mixed into Olympics opening ceremonies? Perhaps it's the same reason why we have so much subtext that comes into our films. There are individuals who may be aware, or at least have some sort of awareness of what transpired in the past, and therefore they attempt to integrate it, whether it's in the plot of certain films or even in a depiction in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. At Sochi, we see many interesting things of the rise of a civilization. Of course, our current mainstream will tell us that this is merely the depiction of the rise of Russia, and that this is supposed to be a Russian patriotic ceremony. And indeed, it may well be. But yet, when we look into the subtext and a lot of the symbolism of this particular ceremony, we see something that seems to allude to far more than just the rise of a single nation. Of course, we recall the fact that our current civilization seems to operate on the basic principle of division. Geographical division, division of the people, division of economic and social class. Was it always that way? It's hard to say, but when you actually go and you observe this opening ceremony from Sochi, you can see that there are many different aspects of humanity that seem to be depicted. Not something that's pertinent to one particular group of people, but perhaps something that depicts the story of us all. The unfortunate events that occurred with the last reset, where the civilization known as Tartaria was completely destroyed. Not a civilization that was confined to one particular set of lands or even one single continent, but one that encompassed the entire land, the world, all of its peoples. And when you look at some of the events that were depicted in the opening ceremony of Sochi, you can get the idea that they're really telling the entire story of humanity. It's from these depictions and these displays that we have an indication of what may have happened to the Fourth Era civilization. We have a force that seems to have come through some sort of strange portal. How exactly did this happen, we don't know the details on. But we even consider the actual Olympic ceremony with the lighting of the 5 Olympic rings, and we're told that the 5th ring didn't properly light, and it was merely a technical difficulty that bedeviled the ceremony. However, it's a very appropriate choice of words because we consider that 5th ring looks like a portal. And indeed, we did see that portal depicted in another part of the ceremony. We saw a representation that could have been the 4th Era civilization that we call Tartaria, represented by a city here. threatened by a force that initially they were able to overcome. The Fourth Era civilization winning their initial victory when they were confronted by whatever the malevolent force truly was. And we consider that to have happened during the Ascendancy period, or the very height of Tartaria's capabilities, when they managed to achieve their greatest architectural achievements, and they had a unified civilization. We have other depictions within the ceremony that show this force coming through a portal and threatening the civilization. Now, of course, this could all just simply be interpretation by what was merely intended to be a beautiful nationalist ceremony. But yet, we're always told that's the explanation, and we have many other strange depictions at many other Olympics, not just the Olympics that occurred in Russia. So it appears as though there's much more that's actually being conveyed that may be hidden in the subtext or the details behind these elaborate opening ceremonies. We can find many representations that might reflect the greater and grander nature of humanity, a nature which we are oftentimes told to ignore or doesn't truly exist. I suggest that you watch the entire opening ceremony at Sochi and the other Olympics, and watch the opening of the Olympic ceremony at London in 2012 and many others. You'll see strange depictions. You'll see some things that do seem like they're representing the athletes and the competition that's about to occur in the manner of world unity, at least that's what we're told the Olympics represents. But when you look deeper into it, you will find a different message. You will see that they seem to be conveying something else that happened in the distant past, without actually saying it. And perhaps the Olympic opening ceremony at Sochi is most notable for what it depicted, with the aspect of a portal, a civilization initially being triumphant, and then eventually being overcome by a malevolent force. A malevolent force that managed to change its tactics and overcome what was a unified and powerful civilization, also a people who were strong internally. There's other strange aspects to the ceremony where you see the way that things are depicted and illuminated and how exactly they show a different nature of humanity. Oftentimes this is something that we do get in these Olympic ceremonies, and as mentioned before, it's not just in the opening ceremonies. It can oftentimes be found in many of the plot details of many films. Even some of the greatest science fiction films have many allusions to the old world or the previous civilization. So if this is where we derive what actually happened, then how did Tartaria's decline really come about? Clearly there were vulnerabilities within the civilization that came about that enabled this malevolent force to overcome it, and this is what led to the final conflict and the downfall of the civilization. We consider the fact that in the Five Eras theory, we have three civilizations that preceded Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. Now, were these civilizations that preceded Tartaria as unified, or were there other details behind them? We really don't know, and we don't really even have clues. We only have scattered legends and myths. What sort of ascendancy did they reach? How far did they come in their architectural capabilities? Or, more importantly, how far did they come in their capabilities of the individual? We have many myths and accounts, whether it's in religious texts or other means, that indicate that human beings in the distant past actually lived much longer. We're told that these are merely legends, and yet when we look around we can see the remnants of a great civilization that had much greater capability than we can imagine. We can think on the earlier eras. Perhaps before Tartaria in the Fourth Era, there was star fort builders in the Third Era, a people who managed a tremendous architectural and geometrically precise, focused civilization. Perhaps it was much more ordered than we can imagine. And it's not to say that any one of these civilizations were completely utopian. Indeed, they all must have had their own vulnerabilities and own issues, and that's why they continue to fall. And perhaps that's what we are unfortunately forced to live, is a cycle. The cyclic repetition of the rise and fall of civilizations. Or perhaps there is a way that we can move beyond it. Perhaps there's a way we can preserve all that which we learn and not have to go through this cycle. We look at what our current civilization is, the Fifth Era as we call it. A civilization that has the hallmarks of a pseudo-civilization in many ways. In the fact that it seems to represent many of the values that we had in the past, and yet there's something about them that just don't feel as though they're completely genuine. As though we're told of wonders and greatness that we can ascend to, and yet all the time we're constantly given reasons why we just can't reach it. Why we don't have the ability to take care of all of our own people, or why we're constantly at conflict with one another. And perhaps the reasons they give us are true. Perhaps there are legitimate reasons for why we have so much division and so much conflict. Or could it be that what we experience every day is simply the remnants of what came before, or the modern and current incarnation of it? The continued division of civilizations and human beings is exactly the vulnerabilities that existed in the previous civilizations that led to their downfall. Yes, one would say there may be a lot of speculation, but I don't believe there's as much speculation as we're led to believe because of the fact that all of these accounts exist in all of our religious texts in every major society that we have across our current civilization today. So it would appear that there are accounts of that civilization reaching its ascendancy, having abilities that we can only begin to imagine to this day. How far did they really go, though, in the last civilization? Did they actually have the ability to draw power in many different ways? Did they have the ability to generate power from the air, from crystals? Did they have all their power needs met? And as a result, they managed to achieve a balanced society. In other words, a balance between an individual contributing to society and then a society that genuinely contributes to the welfare of an individual. Perhaps it's all just a dream, something that cannot actually be achieved. Or maybe that's just what we're supposed to think. Whatever the reality, the undenied achievements of the past have to be considered, because those ruins still exist to this day. And indeed, many of those things that we call ruins, the state capitals, the opera houses, all the wondrous structures that we consider palaces, and then we consider the remnants of the star forts that we have to this day, many of which are in wondrous shape despite all that they've been through, with time, reset, and then even if we accept the mainstream's account of history, consider all the other factors of weathering and the conflicts that they've been through. And yet these structures stand to this day, many in very pristine condition, and many being used currently as government buildings or commercial buildings or any other number of uses. Also consider the infrastructure and logistical capability of the civilizations that came before us. Great airships that had unlimited capability to move vast objects and much great amount of materials across vast distances in a rapid amount of time. Clearly they had some method of energy generation or fuel consumption that was vastly superior to anything we know today. For all we know, perhaps what we use today is the surviving remnants, the derivatives of what came before. Of course, the oftentimes theme that we're given is that we are supposedly at our technological ascendancy at this point now. But is that really true? Or is the reality that we've simply declined from having much more advanced technological capability in the past? Many of the clues that we have and a lot of the evidence that we can see indicate that the civilizations that came before us actually had a greater technological capacity. We cannot replicate the buildings that were constructed in the past. We supposedly can build taller buildings, although we don't know if that's true, and supposedly we can build structures that are much more effective than the structures in the past in terms of housing larger numbers of people and caring for the needs of many people. And yet we can't build or reconstruct many of the state capitals that we have in the United States. You don't see anyone building the great opera houses or palaces that are across Europe, or whatever current designation we give these wondrous structures or edifices across the land. Yet we also consider the destruction and descent of the civilization that preceded ours. They had much greater capability, and yet they still fell. And why exactly did that happen? We've explored that on the channel, and we consider the reset event that occurred, whether it was a natural or artificially induced disaster. Was it plasma fire from the sky? Was it some sort of cymatic force that induced a mud flood and completely destroyed the soil? Was it a vast tsunami or flood? Or was it all three of these events, which eventually eroded and destroyed the civilization's capability to exist and defend itself, leaving it in a state of vulnerability? We don't know the exact details, but we have many different clues. We also consider the fact that there were no doubt survivors from these horrific events, and even from the second conflict, the final conflict that Tartaria faced that led to its final destruction, the attack of what we consider Gog-Magog. Was that really any of its names, or are these just the names that we assign to these events that we only have a recorded myth of, something that we can't officially understand? There's nothing that's actually recorded in epic detail of what truly happened. So all we have are these vague memories, these myths, these accounts that become blurred over time, that become confused. And then, as we establish a new history with constant historical revision, which we know happens, we realize that these events become even more confused. Perhaps Aurelian and the other leaders that were represented at that time were other leaders of Tartaria who fell to the corruption, or perhaps they died trying to defend their civilization. Consider the final destruction of Tartaria, with the last siege of the remaining cities. We have many different accounts of sieges of cities and their destruction, and these are very terrifying accounts of the last remnants of people trying to fight for survival. They must have known for years or decades or perhaps even longer that their destruction was imminent, and they faced a very horrifying reality. They knew that there were many efforts that were undertaken to try to save their civilization and to try to save their cities. And yet, despite their very best efforts, they were unable to defend themselves from this malevolent force that had been terrorizing them for such a long time. And suddenly they found themselves unable to defend themselves. We even have some images that indicate that there may have been cities such as Bologna that had some other means of defense. We're told that the great towers of Bologna were a means of both offense and defense, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, unless perhaps those towers had some other capability. We also consider the works of what we're told is high fantasy from J.R.R. Tolkien, such as the Fall of Gondolin, or indeed the complete destruction of all the elven kingdoms at the end of the First Age, as he calls it. Perhaps this is synonymous, and is indeed an exact account of what happened with not just the civilization that preceded ours, but indeed the civilizations that came before them. There's a lot of myth and a lot of folklore from many different peoples across the land. And yes, we do have accounts of a more biblical sense or a more religious sense of direct evil, of devils, demons, and other creatures. And indeed, there may be details behind that may be true. And for all we know, maybe it is an exact account. We just don't know. And what to make of the so-called heroes or the leaders that tried to preserve the civilization? Were they real? Were they corrupted? Or do we just have a very vague memory of them? We have no shortage of these terrifying apocalyptic images that show the unrelenting destruction of many of these great cities. And we're told that this is merely a time during the Middle Ages when people were driven by fear and superstition. Yet they were also capable of building large cathedrals and tremendous architectural achievements that stand with us to this day. This is why we have so many difficulties with the mainstream account. Why do we have fortifications that are in very remote places in the land? Unless there genuinely was some sort of effort undertaken in the past to try to enable a civilization to survive, an unrelenting threat that had forces beyond our wildest dreams that were constantly attacking and destroying it. And it seems as though these forces of Gog-Magog, or whatever this malevolent entity really was, only grew stronger as they increased the amount of land and lives that they destroyed each and every year in their total and complete destruction of the Fourth Era civilization. The people facing terror, trying to survive, trying to find a place where they could hide or where they'd be safe. Perhaps there was even an attempt to parlay one final negotiation to try to enable some portion of the civilization known as Tartaria to survive. And while there may have been an honest attempt at a parlay or a negotiation, it was simply a ruse. Simply a final ruse to bring down the last defenses of Tartaria, to leave them vulnerable for the attacking forces, which were then unleashed with their full potential, to destroy the remaining cities and to destroy the people of Tartaria, of the Fourth Era civilization that preceded ours, once and for all. And indeed, as we can attest to, everything was destroyed. Their society, their history. The only thing that remained were some of the structures, and indeed the foundation structures, perhaps remnants of the buildings that preceded them. What a terrifying time it must have been to realize that survival was not guaranteed, to realize that people would be without hope and without dreams, and their only hope was to try to live to see the next day. Oftentimes we're told that this is the lowest state of existence for human beings, and there's no doubt about it that in the previous civilizations they did face this many times. We're told in our current mainstream history that other peoples have faced this, and indeed they do to this very day. But I think it's important that we all remember that all of us in some way are connected to these survivors who underwent these trials and tribulations. That as long as there were survivors from this calamity, this downfall of civilization, there will always be hope for the future. Imagine a distant civilization in the past, under assault by various threats. What would that look like? How would that civilization actually respond to those threats? What actions would they take to ensure their survival? We have no shortage of examples of incredible fortifications across the land, built with knowledge that seems to surpass our current capability. But why would any great civilization build these wondrous fortifications, unless they were simply trying to survive their own incoming destruction by various threats that seem to be internal and external? Indeed, this is how we explain why there may have been a last emperor when we consider the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria. The emperor in history. We have no shortage of emperors depicted in the histories of various cultures, and perhaps there's a reason for this. To this day we appreciate emperors, and yet we loathe their existence. Here in this bust of Augustus, he seems to have a small homunculus or a mini-me that's with him. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. And perhaps we start by considering the Roman emperors, as they tend to be the most well-known, at least in what we think of as Western civilization. And yet there's something very peculiar about these Roman emperors when we look at them. Again, we have the very original conflicting account. Some accounts say that these emperors were great leaders and individuals that brought the Roman Empire and ultimately the nascent Western civilization to the pinnacle, at least at the time. Or as the saying from Maximus in the original Gladiator, Rome is the light, and the rest of the world is chaos and darkness. Granted, that second part I just added. But when you look at these emperors, oddly enough, you're determined to see that there seems to be some sort of difference in some of them. And yet, many of the busts look exactly the same. Now, we could attribute this to the fact that they're made of marble, that many of these emperors were from the same family, and, of course, much like in the television shows, we have offspring that look exactly like their parents. But it's another one of those questions that we have to ask. We also consider the account that perhaps emperors, whether we're talking about Roman, Chinese, or any of the other emperors from across the cultures in our written recorded history, maybe one of them had to make a great sacrifice. A sacrifice that's reflected by emperors in fiction, such as the God Emperor in the 40K series. The God Emperor that had to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to save and preserve his civilization. We oftentimes wonder with these conflicting accounts of these emperors, did any of them have to make that final sacrifice? And the question I want to pose to all of you is, why do we have such a fixation on emperors? Whether we're talking historians or even the creators of fiction. There always seems to be an emperor, a great leader, a king, a queen, an empress. There's always one individual who seems to have a lot of the responsibility for the survival of a civilization that's attributed to this one leader. And indeed, when we look at the many different examples, whether we're looking at the Roman Emperor Trajan, or whether we're looking at one of the High Lords of Terra from the Warhammer 40k series, we oftentimes have these individuals who have a lot of responsibility that is attributed to them. Indeed, when you look at the bust of the Roman emperors that we have, one of the questions I've always had is, how exactly did they create these very accurate busts? And were they actually accurate in depicting the facial features? Such as with Emperor Hadrian here. Did they really know that his beard looked exactly like that? Was that the exact look in his eyes? Or was that merely creative license that was done by examining writings after the emperor had been alive? How historically accurate is all of this? Again, these are questions that we oftentimes don't ask because we have such an accurate account, or do we, of the existence of the Roman emperors and the imperial regalia of all of the Roman Empire. And it's the same questions that we have when we look at other civilizations and their respective empires and their great leaders. But was it actually inspired by something? Was there truly a leader who was responsible for the survival of a previous civilization? A civilization that encompassed all or most of the lands that we know of, and perhaps it even included lands that we're not aware of. Is it possible that such an individual would have such responsibilities? And that's the main reason why we have this fixation, if you will, for the existence of these single leaders. And whether it's a queen, a king, an empress, or an emperor, there is no shortage of historical and fictional accounts, although are the two interchangeable? It seems to be that they may be a little more interchangeable than we like to think, such as with the account of Maximus Thrax. Maximinus Thrax was stated to be between 7 and 8 feet tall if we go off of the Historia Augusta, which of course historians tell us it's not reliable. Imagine Maximinus Thrax being 8 feet tall compared to the average Roman being between 5'2 and 5'6. It seems to be an anomaly. And then of course there's the strange account of Emperor Lucius Aurelian, the emperor who was running all over the Roman Empire facing external, internal threats and currency revolts from within, and yet he still had time to pose for his bust being created. Of course, there are some that say that that's not actually his face. So what do we really know about these emperors? And even going on to the Byzantine Empire, another rather strange occurrence because this was actually the Eastern Roman Empire. The term Byzantine Empire was assigned later, oddly enough, by historians. So why exactly would we refer to an empire by a name it was not actually known by within the empire? Good reasons, I guess. Emperor Justinian, considered to be the one who really brought the so-called Byzantine Empire, that remember it was not really called, to its pinnacle. Did he represent some other individual? He had what is supposedly the great general Belisarius assisting him in his military endeavors. This is purported to be Belisarius, although we're not sure. There's also other odd individuals pictured here. And who exactly do these figures truly represent? And why is it that we have certain individuals that look like they might be out of place from a different time frame? This almost looks like F. Murray Abraham before he decided to star in Amadeus. And other strange-looking individuals. Were they actually the leaders who were assisting Justinian? That's what we'd like to believe. Or are these people completely different? Even looking at some of the soldiers that we have here, they have a strange look to them as well. Are these representing actual human beings, or are they different human beings? And indeed, it's not just emperors and empresses that we have to look at, but it's also the accounts of kings and queens, the individual leaders who seem to make a great difference within their nations that we still remember to this day. And yet, for whatever reason, it seems as though historical accounts assign or attribute more importance to them. And then, of course, we've looked at the account of Emperor Charles V. You might recall Charles V, he was the one who ordered the initial survey to be conducted of the feasibility of a canal that cut through the Isthmus of Panama, or Nicaragua, provided, of course, that, there wasn't something there that they could have used to make it easier, and the mainstream account tells us that there was. There's no shortage of the use of the title of emperor or king. What's really the difference, though, when we look and compare at the titles? An emperor who commands or rules an entire empire, and a king who rules a single nation. Did you know that there is still a recognized emperor to this day in Japan? And it's intriguing when we consider these various individuals and how they may have played a role within the affairs of their state or their nation state. It seems as though many of these borders and boundaries and national considerations are a lot more modernly imposed than we like to think. Why is it we have all this reference to these larger empires that may have existed? We also have to think about the fact that there may be certain nations that still exist with the same geographical boundaries, although there's a great debate about the whole concept of geographical boundaries. Was the existence of Japan in the distant past as limited as we've been told? Or did it represent something else, something much larger and more grand and encompassing than we like to believe? Was there a completely different arrangement of society and cultures in the distant past? Of course, it's considered taboo to even ask these questions to this day, but they're questions that we have to ask because we do have many accounts that do have strange parallels to them. And one of the most basic parallels is the actual method and manner in which nations or empires, or the difference between the two, were ruled. In fact, we even have emperor kings or king emperors, or queen empresses. What's really the difference between these titles? And do these titles have any function at all? We also consider the account of Napoleon. Did Napoleon really exist, or did he represent some sort of commander who had gone past his charter during the reset conflict that followed the last reset? Or is it just simply another tale designed to give a little bit of veracity to the current mainstream account? Was this individual actually just a commander who'd gone too far with his authority, or did he not even exist? I've left that to you in the past, and I ask you to let me know in the comments. We also have many empresses in history, such as Empress Irene, and even though we're told that this was limited to the Byzantine Empire, it should be noted that these individuals wielded a lot of authority and influence. There was even statements that potentially Empress Irene was going to join another empire. And I'm once again always amazed at the unique attire that we see in the paintings and the artwork of the distant past. Does any of this look like it would be practicable to wear at any point in time? Of course, the official explanation for whether this was a more modern or a distant past image is that people simply like to look resplendent in whatever they were wearing, having suitable raiment to show their authority. Here we have Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil. Yes, there was a time when Brazil had an emperor. And oddly enough, we have more than a strange resemblance to Ulysses S. Grant, especially with the facial hair. But what is really the truth behind this account of emperors and all these kings, and whether we're considering the account of one of the many Henrys from the history or the official history of Britain, or any of the other lands that had rulers named Henry? Indeed, when you look up how many rulers are named Henry, it's very peculiar. And why would one of the Henrys be visiting his father in this very small, almost dare I say, outhouse-looking prison? Or perhaps you could even say it's a porta-john prison. Maybe they had that in the distant past. And here we have Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Yes, this gets even more convoluted when you consider the Roman emperors and the Holy Roman Emperors. And Henry V, who ruled from 1111 to 1125. What exactly is he holding in his hand there? It looks like he has the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch in his hand. Not exactly sure. But again, it goes to this entire account of who these emperors really were. And indeed, who were these kings? And oftentimes, the entire study of history, and if you ever had the pleasure or the misfortune, depending on your perspective, of going through a class on the Middle Ages of history at any university, you'll find there's all these confused and conflicting accounts of these kings who sought authority. It looks like this particular individual has the entire city of Antioch in his hand, and not just the Holy Hand Grenade. But what does it really reflect? And indeed, what does the account of all these other leaders that we have? Few people are aware of the account of Empress Matilda, and yet she was involved in the secession or the dynastic struggles that occurred in England during the time of Henry and so forth. And let's look at the leaders of Tartaria. Who were the actual leaders? We've looked at the account of Alexander the Great before, and we know that according to official history, Alexander the Great is stated to have been the Macedonian general who unified Greece and then went on a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. We also have the account of Belisarius, and in previous explorations, we've looked at how these commanders may have been involved in a great final conflict, the final conflict for the survival of the Fourth Era civilization. The civilization that we refer to on this channel is Tartaria. We have all of these different maps that seem to depict some great threat. And indeed, in the Crisis of Tartaria, we looked at the threat posed by what we view as the Empire, or whatever you want to call it, the peoples of Gog-Magog. Was this an internal or an external threat that was actually facing the Fourth Era civilization? And we've posited that it must have been both an internal and an external threat. And perhaps that's the real account with all these emperors and all these great achievements. There's also the many accounts of corruption and difficulty that they faced. Everyone's well familiar with the account of Nero who fiddled as Rome burned. Was there some leader who was charged to attempt to save or preserve the civilization that didn't fulfill their duties, or had also succumbed to the corruption influences from within, as many others had? We've looked at the account of how Alexander the Great, also named in other societies and cultures which we would not normally associate with Alexander the Great, and the attempts of his forces to construct a wall to keep out these invading forces that threaten civilization. Indeed, many remnants of this great wall can still be viewed to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, and it is attributed to the efforts of Alexander the Great, even though in the official history there's no account of Alexander the Great during his supposed historical time frame, erecting these great fortifications. And it's also yet another account of, in the past, trying to utilize fixed fortifications to defend a civilization. Now, any military mind from any time frame will tell you that fixed fortifications are merely a monument to the intransigence of humanity. They tend not to work when you're facing a mobile army. But perhaps they make a lot more sense if you're trying to bring about the survival of your civilization and you're facing imminent annihilation. Or a more direct form for it is to simply say you're going into a hedgehog defense. You have no choice and you're simply trying to survive. And indeed, if we look at many of the great structures and many of the installations that are still around to this day, this suddenly makes a lot more sense. That the reason that they're still around is the fact that they were built to last and they were built to endure and to try to survive whatever forces and whatever threats that they were facing in that time. We've looked at other cities and other installations that still survive to this day that seem to have been constructed with threats from the air in mind. And you might recall our recent exploration when we looked at the lost tales of the Native Americans and all the settlements in the southwest of the United States that almost seem to have been built with the concept of defense or concealment from attack and observation from the air. A very unique and interesting series of details that once again paint conflicting accounts to what we've been told by the mainstream account of history given to us by the scholars who study and repeat what they are told to study and repeat. I always found the account of Alexander the Great the most intriguing because when you look at other cultures' accounts of Alexander, and you look at these supposed legends and myths that attribute him to being in the Caucasus Mountain regions and establishing these fixed fortifications to try to bring about the survival or try to enable the previous civilization to survive, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. But going back to the account of the actual emperor, I know that many viewers of this channel will certainly ask, Aurelian, you've theorized that in the past the leadership and the government of the Fourth Era civilization didn't rely on a strict hierarchy like we have now. And that's true. But I also have to consider the fact that we do have this idea of everything being brought about, all this responsibility, to one single leader. And whatever title we wanted to assign to that leader, it seemed to make sense to me that we have to consider the account that perhaps there was a series of leaders or one final leader, the last emperor, who tried to facilitate the survival of the Fourth Era civilization, the civilization we call Tartaria on this channel. But what kind of efforts did they really have to go through, and were they really successful? Ultimately, we can conclude that they were not successful, that indeed the entire civilization was destroyed, both from within and without. But what sort of terrors did they really face? What efforts did they really go through to try to survive the crisis? And we have explored the crisis before and what it was really about. We've had symbolic representations in recent events such as Olympic opening ceremonies that point to a different possibility concerning what the previous civilization may have faced. That it seemed as though that there was some sort of portal or some sort of access point that opened, allowing the others to access this land or this realm or whatever you want to refer to it as. And that this threat was unlike anything that they had faced. They had managed to overcome it in the direct conflict. But yet it seems that this adversary, this opponent, changed their tactics. They managed to infiltrate the very essential infrastructure, and indeed the institutions of the Fourth Era civilization. Perhaps they even had the ability to corrupt the individuals from within. And no doubt they would have targeted the leaders. They would have targeted those who had the responsibility. And perhaps that's the real cycle that we face. And it explains the very basis of the Five Era civilization that this channel uses to try to explain what came in the past. Because if we had 5 eras in the past, it comes about that it's always a cycle. There's always a civilization that manages to rise and reach a pinnacle. Now, how far each civilization that came before ours reached, we can debate it. But we have a lot of indicators that they managed to build wonders beyond our imagination. Indeed, no one can tell you exactly how a pyramid was constructed. We have many theories, but that's exactly what it remains to this day. Even from mainstream history, just theories in terms of how these structures were constructed. And whether we're talking about a pyramid or even an Art Deco building, we have so many questions. The main question being, why is it we can't construct these structures today in the manner that they were constructed in the past? And even when we look at the images that we have of the previous eras, what things may have appeared as, whether we're looking at the elaborate and geometrically precise star forts that may have existed in the Third Era, and they may well have been the foundation of the structures that were built on top of by the Fourth Era. And indeed, we still have these remnants of these wonderful structures and all this infrastructure all over the land that's still found to this day. It explains the great catacombs and all of the underground infrastructure that we can't really account for. Unless we're to believe that a group of people, especially within the United States, managed to construct rapid underground sewers and vast infrastructure in a very limited amount of time, and they managed to lay out many great cities and vastly increase their population, all within under 100 years. Of course, we've looked at other explanations for why in the current Fifth Era we seem to be unable to construct a very simple, small pyramid out of the same construction materials, or whether we're talking about one of the great many dome buildings, such as a national or state capitol that we have across the land, or whether you want to call it a capitol or a palace or whatever name we have for these current structures. We seem to have a lack of ability in constructing them, and it's one of the main components of evidence that we have that indicate that the accounts that we're given are not accurate. Of course, some people will say that just because you can reference something that's written down somewhere, it's incontrovertible proof. It is an incontrovertible fact that it must have happened. And it may be true. But it's very odd when you consider it and you apply a little critical thinking that certain things don't add up. Oftentimes, no one will ever bother to try to answer the logistics question behind all the wonderful structures that were constructed. And perhaps that's really where the concept of the last leader or the last emperor of Tartaria really comes into the final question. What were the last achievements of the previous civilization? What were the very last structures that they completed before their downfall? And oftentimes we think that it must have been the structures that we've looked at, the monasteries and the fortifications that we have, that were built as a last-ditch effort to try to preserve any bit of the civilization to make it to the next era. And perhaps it's because of those efforts that we even have any of the clues that we do to this day of the wonders that may have come in the past. Many people simply accept the fact that our civilization has always been on the ascendant, that there's only one civilization that's ever existed, that it goes from the evolution, if you will, of human beings from other forms of life the changes in the development of intelligence, and as Carl Sagan liked to say, and then we just started to talk. And that was really the birth of our civilization. And you know what? It may all be true, but there's so many fallacies with it when we consider the critical thinking aspect. We have to be open to other possibilities. And it's one of the reasons why we've embarked on these explorations, because we have to search for explanations for what really came in the past. We have to really understand who we are. It's the greatest endeavor of human existence, because it's part of our journey, to look within and to understand who we are, and most importantly, who we have the potential to be. Because if we consider ourselves free of this corrupting influence that we always come across, this unfortunate focus on things that perhaps do not suit our best interest, then it could be possible that we could achieve the wonders that we had in the past. And maybe one day we could even have a civilization that exceeds those wonders, that we really could explore new areas and we really could develop ourselves from within. And who knows, maybe the real answer is perhaps something that transcends the physical realm. And oftentimes this blurs the line between spiritual and temporal affairs. And it's one of the main reasons why I'm not in the practice of telling people what to believe. I don't have to tell you what to believe. I respect the fact that you can believe whatever explanation is most fitting. Maybe you think Carl Sagan's explanation in terms of the history of the land is most fitting. Or maybe you believe in what you find in the Bible or any of the other holy works as the real explanation for how things came to be. I don't believe in discounting anything, because I believe that all the clues and all the evidence is scattered across anything and everywhere. And indeed that would make the most sense because of the fact that we have so much division that seems to be imposed within our current civilization. Now, whether this division is intentional or it's simply the unintentional consequences of the current arrangement of our society, we can certainly debate that. But we can't deny that it is very present. And we certainly can't deny that there seems to be many individuals who follow what appears to be a planned process, if you will, of depriving us of the ability of searching within. And perhaps that's the most compelling thing when we consider the account of the last emperor of Tartaria. And indeed we consider an entire civilization across the land that worked together. Now, oftentimes people misquote me or misattribute the fact that I tried to suggest that this civilization was egalitarian. I don't think there was anything with egalitarian, at least in terms of how the people all existed. It just seemed to be that the civilization had achieved a balance by balancing both the needs of the individual with the needs of the society and the overall civilization itself. Imagine if you had a civilization that, instead of trying to conform individuals to fit in a box, actually catered to the strengths of the particular individual. What could you achieve? And if you actually had a civilization that focused on this and achieved spiritual awareness, in addition to the limitations of physical reality, then suddenly they could overcome those limitations. Suddenly, with a long enough timeline and a focus on both the artistic and the practical, you could achieve many of the great wonders that we see all around us. And if there was one individual who had found themselves directing this and had all this responsibility attributed to them, then perhaps it really showcased the fact that instead of achieving the balance, they had become unbalanced. And ultimately that led to the final downfall of Tartaria. It's all a very compelling account, and it's one of the reasons why I needed to consider the last emperor of Tartaria. We really needed to look at how this all could have come down with the leaders and what role they played. Were they able to preserve the elements of civilization, or has it all just simply been diminished to myth and legend, and that's all we have, with details that have been scattered, along with the final destruction? We have to take the hypothesis that it seems that the final destruction occurred much more abruptly than anyone at that time had any idea that it was going to happen. And indeed, if you think about the fact that all the records were completely destroyed, that there was a diaspora and a dysphoria that was inflicted on the population all across the land. The other thing that we aren't entirely sure on, but we have clues, is how exactly was the corrupted internal portion of the previous civilization responsible for the destruction of the people? and perhaps a destruction beyond just a physical death, but also the destruction of the society. Imagine if you have an entire society that wants to forget what had happened in the past because in their mindset it was so terrible that they did not want to retain their own knowledge, that they willingly gave it up. And indeed, there have been a couple allusions to this, and whether you're looking at a fictional story or there's even historical accounts, where it seems as though the people willingly gave up the understanding of their own identity. It seems like it's something that goes against everything that we would expect people to value and believe. But we have to ask the question, is it something that came internally, or was it external? Did the people really reach a state of despair that they wanted to forget their past? Or was this just simply an approach that was imposed upon them? Imposed upon them by corrupted leaders, the very leaders who had been corrupted by the forces that had attacked their civilization externally, and had now found the ultimate vulnerability. And perhaps that vulnerability stays with us to this day. These concepts of pride, of self-righteousness, or another way of saying it, the infuriating nature of righteousness. The idea that you're right and someone else is wrong, and that gives you the right to do anything to make those people see you're right. Perhaps that's something that we oftentimes overlook. And yet there's no shortage of depictions and illustrations that show us that this is indeed what had happened in the past. That there were groups of people who were turned against their fellow humans and were all too willing to engage in this open destruction. And what sort of forces of destruction did they really have at their hands for their disposal to tear down their own civilization? What sort of weapons did they have? And were these weapons limited to machinations, or were there biological weapons that we can't even begin to imagine? Indeed, if you step back far enough and you look at all the possibilities, and we do have evidence of what the civilization before achieved in terms of building its own infrastructure, then we also have to consider what sort of forces they had at their disposal to destroy that civilization. Now, it seems clear that there were some structures in some areas that were more susceptible to the destructive effects of these technologies, whether we're talking about frequency or sound technology, or perhaps even some sort of energy projection technology that we can't even begin to imagine. It approaches the realm of science fiction. And then, of course, there's all the methods of destruction that we have within science fiction and high fantasy accounts. Creatures, chimeras, and other strange hybrid creatures that have the ability of destruction within them. And once again, we'll be informed that this is all just simply product of wild imagination. It's all just a fiction. Yet these same people will also believe that people who simply had no greater technology than horses and carts and sailing ships managed to build these very impressive structures. They managed to build star forts and great cathedrals. They did so during a time when their civilization and their society was vastly uneducated, again according to the mainstream account, and also susceptible to various plagues. Now, is that what really happened? Or is that just simply what we're informed happened, and that what really happened was something far more devastating and far more calculated, far more concentrated with its destruction of the previous civilization? And don't forget what had happened to the people. And we always have that disturbing question. Did the people really understand what was happening? Did they want to forget their past? Or was it imposed upon them? The final account of the last emperor of Tartaria. Was this one single individual? We can certainly look at all the societies and all their respective cultural histories for the important individuals and leaders within their respective histories. We also have to attribute to the fact that looking at those histories, there is quite a fixation on the emperors and the great leaders who seem to make a difference. And whether we're talking about the East, the West, the North, the South, or any of these civilizations, we have no shortage of accounts of the achievements of their great leaders in the past. Indeed, the achievements which only seem to bring about a brief period in which some sort of unity was achieved. And of course, the recurring theme is that over time it eroded. Is that really just a microcosm for what we have at a larger scale when we look at the eras of civilization? It may be true. But there's nothing wrong with actually looking at the details and trying to come to a conclusion and understanding. Indeed, we're informed that the period of the Middle Ages, the knights and their concept of chivalry was not true, that it was a much darker time and that it only applied in certain cases. Yet we're also informed that during the Middle Ages it really wasn't that bad. There really weren't dark ages. Always interesting when they retract these accounts and walk them back. Perhaps one of the candidates for the last emperor of Tartaria could have been the account of the legendary Prester John. Did Prester John really exist? And does it warrant an exploration in and of itself? Looking at the official historical accounts of Prester John. Now, officially, the efforts to locate Prester John had failed because Prester John was just a myth. And all the efforts of the Portuguese and Spanish sailors and navigators to try to locate the kingdom of Prester John failed, or it was attributed to something else. But could there have been some sort of historiosity with this individual? Could this have been one of the last surviving leaders? And perhaps, we don't know the exact timeline, what sort of influence and capability did this individual have? And why exactly did this final enclave itself finally fall? These are all questions that we're going to consider in upcoming explorations. Because if we concern ourselves with who the last emperor of Tartaria was, perhaps it's not as important as who it was, in terms of what their final achievements did bring about. Because it seems clear that there was enough detail that survived, that this concept was never really wiped away from the collective conscience of human beings. Now it seems as though there's only certain human beings that are even willing to consider it. And when there's others who tell you that you're not allowed to think certain things, or you're not allowed to even concern yourself with certain things, or that even by thinking or considering a possibility, you must have some sort of mental aberration, then you suddenly realize that it has nothing to do with the actual objective of facts. It has everything to do with total control. And another example I'll give you is the Great Empire of the Dawn from the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire series. And it was very similar to some of the accounts of the great legends of China with the legendary sage emperors, beginning with a great god emperor and then followed by others who succeeded them, with the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Amethyst Empress. And as time went on, these emperors had shorter lifespans. And then eventually, they were corrupted by the Bloodstone Emperor, an individual who brought about a near destruction and a complete destruction of the great Empire of the Dawn. Perhaps that's an analogy, a parallel for what may have happened in the past, where we either had a family or a series of individuals, and perhaps the last individuals who really cared about preserving civilization. Imagine that concept. Leaders who actually put the people that they were supposed to be in charge of before their own needs. We certainly like to say it in this current civilization, but we're rather hard-pressed to find actual examples of it really happening. Is it possible that there was a civilization where there was a leader that actually cared that much and really put the needs of the civilization before their own? Or is that simply a fiction, a fantasy? Is it really possible that there was one point in time where there was a leader that actually cared that much? Or was it just simply the product of high fantasy? And indeed, we often find this debate, this conflict, this internal and this external conflict in all realms of official history and fiction. But as always, I leave it to you. What are your thoughts? Was there a last emperor of Tartaria? Who was it? How effective were they? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. About a year ago on the channel in the spring of 2023, we did an exploration called Designs of the Old World, where we looked into the particular designs of these rather erratic French architects, Lequeux, pictured here, and Boully. We don't really have a picture of Boully, but here's a very intriguing picture of Lequeux. Looks like he could be portrayed by Thomas Hulse in a movie, and looks quite similar to what we saw of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the eponymous film, Amadeus. Regardless, the works of these particular architects are quite intriguing. We're told that these French architects, draughtsmen, or all the other different names that we have for individuals who design buildings, because we need to have many different names for them, are considered very eccentric and elaborate. And indeed, this particular sphere here shows us a rather unique architectural format. Now, of course, we're told that these were merely the buildings that existed in the imaginations or the conceptualizations of these French architects. And I suggested about a year ago that, in fact, these were actually recordings of buildings that may have existed. Now, what's the evidence behind this? I figured we'd go back and we'd actually take a look that this is actually a full archive of the structures that may have remained from the previous civilization. In the drawings that are attributed to Lequeux, we see a great precision in detailing. And if you want to go back and watch the video from last year, I'll attach it in the description for this video. But in these images that we're reviewing, you can see that he left no detail spared when he was considering the layout for these buildings. For example, look at the top of this particular structure, and we see this ornamental detailing at the top. Is that just from his elaborate imagination? What exactly is with this very tall needle spire here on this part of the structure? It's really unique, and oftentimes it gives the impression that really what we have is simply a recording, that what they were doing is that they were recording what they saw, that this wasn't some elaborate imagination. Now here's where it gets more interesting, is when you look at some of his other structures, look at the interior behind this one. What exactly is this? This appears to be under rock. And we think about all the theories that we have concerning melted buildings. And indeed, we have seen these phenomena before. Whether you're looking at the coke kiln ovens in Utah that John Levi has so wonderfully explored, or many other structures. So why would someone lay out a structure like this in a conceptualized design that was displaying this? Unless what they were really looking at was the remnants of a structure that had survived a reset from the previous civilization, and they were recording it before it was going to be demolished, salvaged, certainly not repurposed for use. Look at this very intricate, this looks to be like a fountain, but who knows exactly what this is for sure. Perhaps this is some sort of advanced power generation device or some form of technology we can't understand. Now, I'm well aware we're going to be derided for even considering this, but I'm not hesitating now. And given the fact that the channel's been going for a year, I think we've shown many examples in on-site explorations where we see architecture like this and a different purpose. And it seems that our friends Lequeux and Boully were the perfect individuals who could record this. Now, you might recall this very interesting interior that we have for this particular structure. What exactly is this? Well, this came up a couple different times as some sort of crystal power generation technology. What exactly was going on with this fire? Is this some sort of generator, or is this something else entirely? Interestingly enough is that these drawings are so detailed, these works of art, that they really do come off as being actual recordings, cross-section recordings. And indeed, this is the kind of detail that we'd expect to see in many of the structures that we've explored on the ground, and yet for whatever reason, the plans, the schematics just aren't available, or if they are, they're in a single perspective. And yet when we look at these works, for example here, what's going on here? Is this actually a cave exploration, or is this again a recording of something that remained from a previous civilization? You notice the focus on what appears to be a monument or a memorial, or at least that's what we think of it as. And yet underground here in this cave, we have this very elaborate statue, this fountain, that seems to be depicting something that we would not consider modest, since we're told that the mores of society, when these schematics, these concepts were drawn, were a little different than what they are now. So it's something that really defies what we're told about history and the narrative. And we do see that from both Lequeux and Boully, very elaborate designs. Incredible fountains, multi-layer structures, and very unique architectural stylings. And yet at the same time, while we're told that this is some sort of elaborate and eccentric conceptualization, we've seen examples of these in every city in the Midwest of the United States, in many cities in Europe, and in Asia and everywhere else that we've explored. We've seen examples of this fine detailed architecture. Even the size of the interior of the structure, which is featured on the thumbnail for this exploration, look at the size of these columns and their height. Now remember, we have that Grand Avenue water tower in St. Louis, and remember how tall that column was. Now imagine what kind of structure you could really achieve if you had this many columns. Again, this is something that was considered eccentric, and this is supposedly attributed to Boli, but I don't think it really matters who it's attributed to. Look at the gargantuan and colossal interior of this particular structure. What exactly is going on here? Again, is this something they're recording, or is this some sort of event that was occurring in the structure before it was brought down? It's very detailed, and indeed you can see how far the columns go. One could think that this would invigorate the imaginations, or perhaps what this was a recording of a structure that existed, and it's now found its way into other what we would consider fantasy drawings, and indeed it's now affiliated with fantasy, and there's a very defined reason for that. And yet in these other structures, we've seen similar layouts in many of the large Union stations that we've looked at, where it seems as though we're looking at a hangar of some sort. What would really be the purpose for laying out a building like this, with all these columns lining the walls? And we're to believe that looking at the image, this is a library, and yet this seems to be a massive hangar. We've seen these indentations and impressions before on other structures. What's with the opening at the top? Well, it's to provide lighting so that they could read during the day because they didn't have electricity at that time. That seems rather comical now. And yet this would be a very interesting repurposing of this building if it still stood and they were attempting to salvage all the books that they had. But what was its original intention and purpose? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. And yet Buli had other designs attributed to him. For example, we see the classic pyramid design here. Very, very advanced looking with some obelisks flanking it on either side. And yet when you look at the structure, you can see that this is smaller blocks, and yet there's a fine pattern detailing within this. Now, think about the effort that went into this sketch as well. What kind of effort did someone put into sketching this? And just zoom in a little bit here so you can actually see the size of individuals, people, for scaling. Although, of course, that's not always reliable because who knows exactly how tall these people depicted in this image are. Now, once again, this will be derided, but if you look in other aspects of this image, you can see that there's more obelisks on the other side of this pyramid structure. So again, is this something that survived the reset from a previous civilization? There seems to be some definitive evidence for that. And we also have Buli's other drawings where it's not just pyramids, but we also have spheres, the same spheres that were depicted by Lequeux, supposedly, that depict a completely different kind of architectural styling. And yet, once again, for some reason, these particular sketches, these drawings, this elaborate imagination of Buli, here where we're mixing a sphere with a pyramid or cone structure, somehow this has survived to reach us. Now, is it really just so simple to say that this is the wild imagination of an architect with too much time on their hands? I'm always amazed at all the time that we seem to think that our architects have, that they can do so many projects at the same time. And then as if that's not enough, they can then devote their time to doing conceptual projects. And they just like to draw. And oddly enough, you do have art that's associated with architects. And yet at the same time, Art Deco is considered a thing of the past. And the justification will be because people wanted brutalist architecture, people wanted postmodern architecture, because it's a little bit more convenient. What are your thoughts looking at this intriguing structure with this large sphere and this cone and the size and the scale? And clearly these seem to be columns. What scale is this? Would this be achievable with today's technology? No, of course not. We'll be told that this is merely the wild imagination of some architects with too much time on their hands. That they could lay out buildings that were utterly gargantuan in size and didn't really make a lot of sense at that time, and they don't make any sense now. But the troubling aspect is we have seen many of the details of these structures. We've seen them in all of our explorations on the ground. So if the details exist, was this just someone putting it together with their imagination to make something that was just beyond the scope of reality? And why do I keep mentioning the fact that these were legitimate architects, at least that we're told that they were? Well, because they did actually design buildings. Indeed, there's a hotel in Paris that was designed by Buli. And yet at the same time, he was also conceptualizing these very impressive structures, these large spheres. It seems to me that this is indicative of a completely different architectural style that did not exist to the official account. And yet this is an indication of something that did exist. And what do we have here? Our favorite lions, because of course we always have our lions by our buildings. And then a compilation of works supposedly attributed to Booley. We've seen this one in the lower right. And in the upper right, we see what appears to be some very interesting power generation device. Now, of course, we'll be told that it's supposed to be some sort of observatory, some sort of planetarium, because it's a sphere, and we automatically associate sphere with round and globe, and etc., etc. And yet we're seeing more indications of architectural stylings. And indeed, imagine a world capital, or perhaps I should say a land capital of an entire civilization that would reach this size, where you have a pediment this extensive, lines of people walking up to the entryway, and numerous columns, along with a dome, flanked by many, many, many columns. What exactly is this telling us, and how large is this cupola at the top? And what are your thoughts on these images? And I'll close off by just saying the rather modest hotel that still stands to this day that's attributed to Booley. And yet, interestingly enough, it does still show old world construction, design, and detailing around this portal window, and then a very well designed column. But what other evidence do we have that would give us the indication that these designs attributed to these erratic and yet ingenious French architects were a little bit more than simply the product of their imaginations? If you scan our libraries and our own archives, what you'll find is no shortage of books that were supposedly composed by architects. Yes, they tell us that architects did these very painstakingly rendered sketches or drawings of the exterior and interiors of what we consider to be old world buildings. This particular one was published in the 1880s or so, we're told, although oftentimes I question that. And yet, what we'll see is the elaborate interior of many different structures, whether it's a cathedral, a church, a basilica, or whatever we've decided to call it now. And we'll see many of the same detailings that we've seen in our on site explorations, whether we were in state capitals or any other sort of building where we see the massive columns, we have the impressions within the ceiling. This looks to be like a massive oculus, and we have a pediment here. And then you can see the individuals in this drawing with the stairway to give you an idea for scale. What's intriguing is that these architects, again, seem to have all kinds of time to where they could go around and compose books that are well over 500 pages with all these wondrous sketches. Now, how much time was involved in doing these sketches? And the other question that would come down to is, why didn't they just do a picture documentation? Or perhaps this was a different way of doing that. And indeed, we can see many of the fine details and questionable symbols that we've come across in our old world explorations, throughout on-site explorations and all across the land. Now, what is this really showing us? I am under the impression that once again, this is an archive. This is a record of surviving examples of structures, and even alluding to technology, that we're told that was done under the facade of an architect to preserve all this. Now, there's no doubt that it was to be preserved, but preserved in what fashion? And could this have been simply a massive catalog or a compendium of everything which had survived, the most dramatic examples, which those in power might feel could potentially cause questions that they didn't want asked? For example, in this particular sketch, again from the 1880s, we see stylings that we would associate with the Art Deco style, although we're told that Art Deco is very much a product of the 20th century. So this seems to be another anachronism, something that doesn't match what we're told in the timeline. Or maybe you're just going to say you're using your imagination. This isn't actually Art Deco styling. But what's really going on with all this detailing? And we can see that this particular architect decided to capture other things which we wouldn't traditionally associate with architecture, but more of an art affiliation with it. So was it really an architect drawing this, or was it someone else? Because again, we see signs of the technology that's been captured, and that seems to be the intent behind it. Now, if you go to a later portion of this same book, you will find that they also decide to detail what they call trophies or compilations of what appears to be coats of arms and urns and other decorations. Yes, once again, we see our favorite griffin depicted here on what appear to be urns. But are these urns? This kind of reminds me of that owl that we saw in that courthouse in Iowa. So very intriguing when we see many of the replications of the symbols all over the place that show us different aspects of the previous civilization. Obviously, this seems to be something that was done as a great catalog, but the fact that we're told that this is merely an architect who is concerned with capturing certain portions of buildings, and yet they seemed more concerned with artwork. And indeed, you'll find that there is a catalog of statues in this compendium. What exactly does that have to do with architecture? Well, everything, because we need to put statues to make it into complete architecture, right? We've seen this particular object before, and we've speculated that maybe it has something to do with power generation, or it reflects something of the previous civilization. And here it's just put in this nice little urn. And then we see other devices that have been very painstakingly cataloged, again in sketches, not with photographs. Now, why would someone go to all this trouble to make all these sketches? Obviously, all these things that we're looking at existed, or maybe it's not so obvious. But if it's not so obvious, then who had the time and inclination, especially in the 1800s, to compose something from their imagination? And now you see how it relates back to the works of Lequeux and Boly that we looked at earlier in this exploration. Why would somebody be devoting time, especially in that time frame that we're told, where people had no time? In fact, we're told that people worked long days, 7 days a week, and they walked uphill to school both ways. And yet we see other interesting symbols and aspects. For example, we've seen this particular symbol before. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the name of it is, I don't think I should have to. But let's just say we've seen this sort of geometry in many different explorations, whether it's a state capitol or just some random commercial building, or even that lovely plumber building in Rochester, Minnesota. It all comes up and it's all repeated in many different examples. And yet, once again, we see that they decide to capture some of the tombs. Now, why would they be so concerned about the tombs? And remember that in the earlier works, we saw this focus on tombs. Or are these tombs? Are these vaults that are, once again, remnants of a previous civilization, with their detailing captured on them? So many different details in so many different places, and let's consider the fact that somebody had to go through the trouble of building this. Somebody should have original sketches or schematics, and then we're to believe that an architect came around later and decided they were going to do sketches in a 500-page book. And so many books that you can't even count that were 500 pages or more that show all these fine-tuned examples. I'd almost think that there was some sort of old world explorer going around in the 1800s that was going around doing these kind of sketches to record this. Although I'm not under the impression that they had the same intention of exploration that we do. What this feels like is that these objects, these devices, these pieces of technology, or this architecture as we consider it, was simply being recorded and cataloged. Now, was that for redesignation? Was that for some sort of method of deciding what was going to remain and what was going to be removed, if they indeed had the means? Well, that's up for you to decide. Let me know what you think in the comments. But still, it's a lot of work and a lot of effort just to record all this, just to get the details that we see. And yet we see so many of the signs, so many of the symbols that we've actually seen in many of our on-site explorations over the past year. There's also a focus on statues. Now, I'm not going to repeat the point that what's an architect doing sketching statues and what's supposed to be a work that's documenting architecture. And we have all these questionable aspects with the statues. Is this really the Virgin holding the Savior, or is this depicting something else? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. We also have these urns or these fountains that are depicted, whatever purpose that we're given with them. And again, we see aspects of the same symbolism that we've come across in our other explorations. So very well documented. And yes, I am going to use that terminology because somebody did go through a lot of effort to sketch all of this and to catalog all this for inclusion within this book. And we're lucky that we're able to gaze on all these different aspects because we see not only detailed architecture, not only advanced construction, but also signs and hints of much more advanced technology that comes down in all these different, what do we want to call these? Altars, these trophies, these fountains, these wells. Yes, you need to have a very well-designed well. Get it? But then last but not least, the book concludes with some of the most advanced decorations that you'll see, and that's what we'll be told. These are just decorations on a window. It gives a whole new meaning to window dressing, doesn't it? Look at how this was achieved. Think about this. Was this really carved out? And yet this drawing even includes the actual individual bricks and every single detail in terms of what was actually rendered here. And when you really look at this, you can actually see it. You just have to think of all the time that, again, went into the effort to originally construct this, whether this was sculpted, carved, even bigger laugh, or if this is some sort of advanced geopolymer that was formed through some technique that we don't fully understand, and then poured in place. Or was it some sort of advanced 3D printing? Or was it some sort of combination of techniques that we can't even begin to imagine? These are the kind of ideas that we get when we look at these very impressive images. And we think about the different aspects of either modular construction, whether these were constructed in different pieces and then assembled. But then I also ask you to think about the individual who went through the trouble of cataloging and documenting all this with all these painstaking drawings and every single detail that they captured. Also pay attention to the symbols. You'll see everything that we've seen: lions, griffins, fasces, numerous columns, different other sorts of figures that indicate other things. This cartouche, this display device, whatever you want to call it. We have so many different names for it, but we've seen the same thing, and we've seen it all over the land. It doesn't matter where we are or what we're doing, we see the same symbols. And once again, this gives us that impression and that evidence that we did have a civilization that spanned the lands. The same civilization that reflected all of its grandeur and its architecture and its surviving technology. And when you look at all these books and all these renderings, and there's thousands upon thousands of drawings just like this that show this kind of detailing, this is just window dressing. And yet somebody had the time, the effort, and the inclination to do this, to decorate a window in this manner. And we've seen this all over the realm. We've seen this all over the land. All these figures and all the effort that went into imposing this just on a window. And somebody decided to take the effort to draw it after this was done. So what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Are we really to believe that the people of the medieval time frame and then the Renaissance and then the 16 to the 1800s had all that time, all that effort, all those resources that they decided to build all these buildings and then put this kind of detailing into it? That they even continued this up until the early 1900s, according to our official account, and then they just decided to stop it because then World War II happened. And after World War II, no one seemed interested in projecting artwork in their structures anymore. We went to brutalist and then postmodern, where everything was supposedly functional, cost-effective, and economically viable. And yet the same thing supposedly applied in the past, and yet for whatever reason, we're to believe that the previous civilizations that were told in our official history that preceded us, and some of them that still exist to this day, had the time, the inclination, and the logistical capacity to achieve these wondrous works of art in their simple window dressings. So yes, I don't think I'll ever hear window dressing with the same term again. But in conclusion, what we're really seeing is that this work of art is something that we just don't really do anymore. And we're supposed to believe it's because we lack the inclination. It's not because we lack the capability. Or some will argue that we lack the capability because people have changed and everyone's just gotten lazy and people don't work as hard as they used to. And if you just work hard, then you can achieve logistical impossibilities because you didn't need heavy machinery. You didn't need the ability to haul construction materials over many miles or hundreds of miles with a limited logistical capacity to even establish the building blocks for many of these structures that still stand to this day. And my final closing point is that this seems to show us true evidence that there was an effort made to record all the remnants of the old world. And you can find it with the detailings of these structures, many of which still stand to this day, showing their exterior and the interiors. And then when you consider the works of what we're told are attributed to extravagant and exotic French architects who just had too much time on their hands, it suddenly brings an entirely different perception towards their works. Perhaps what they were really doing is they were really recording the structures that did remain or had somehow survived the reset before they were brought down and repurposed or the building materials salvaged for use in other buildings. But what are your thoughts? I'll include the link to this particular book in the description of the video. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. the most alluring aspects of exploration is finding ruins in a very remote location, such as in Amazonia or the Amazon, the great rainforest that spans over 2 million square miles in South America. And why is the location of ruins so alluring? We always have these dreams of finding great civilizations, and indeed, we're told by our official sources that at the start of the 20th century, in the 1900s, there was a great effort to explore the unexplored sections of the world. Of course, we're told that these efforts focused on the Arctic and the Antarctica regions, and we have many documented sources about these stories. And yet another story we talk about is the lost city of Z, the theory of British gentleman explorer Percy Fawcett in his efforts to find a civilization lost in the great Amazon rainforest. How exactly did this story or this indication of a lost civilization come to be? We're going to look at the account of Percy Fawcett, the gentleman explorer, and we're also going to consider what was really going on at the start of the 20th century. What were his true objectives? And is there the likelihood of some fabulous lost civilization in the Amazon rainforest? Something else we have to consider, looking at our own explorations into the existence of an old world. If it is indeed true that many of the ruins of the old world are in the great cities that we inhabit to this day, then what were they really looking for in the early 20th century or the early 1900s, depending on how you want to phrase it? What was the real objective of these explorations? Was this just merely the vanity of a British gentleman explorer who'd allowed his imagination to run wild? Or did he actually have an intention, a purpose? Was he really looking for some potential lost civilization that had existed in the Amazon rainforest? It certainly doesn't seem to be an unfounded suspicion that there could be a lost civilization there. And we're told that the numerous expeditions that Percy Fawcett engaged on were wrought with danger, and yet he managed wondrous discoveries in the Amazon. The first person we have to look at, though, is who was Colonel Percy Fawcett? Well, we have to go back to the very beginning of his story. And when we consider who Colonel Percy Fawcett was, a gentleman explorer, we look at the many aspects of his career. He was a British artillery officer, he was a cartographer, a surveyor, and an explorer. You might be surprised to know that he was not an architect. I was a little surprised myself. But there were many rumors going around about the possibility of lost civilizations across the land in the early 1900s. At least that's what the official account tells us. And of course, we're well aware of the accounts of the late 1800s of Shangri-La and the other legendary cities or civilizations that we've explored. We know for the mainstream historical fact that there was an Incan civilization in South America. There were the Aztecs, there were the Mayans, all stretching along from South America to North America. So it doesn't seem like it's a far-fetched notion, even from a mainstream perspective, that there could be a lost civilization. The Amazon is a very large place, and it's also very dense. It's quite easy to hide many different things there. And when you really look at that rainforest, and if you've ever actually been there, or if you're there now as you're watching this video, you're well aware that it's a very extreme climate, a different environment with constant rainfall, and many different interesting challenges from the flora and the fauna. The animals and the trees are all a unique combination. So when you need to explore this area, you send Major Jackson Teller. No, you send Major Percy Fawcett at the time. And here's our first image of Percy Fawcett, although I do joke that Charlie Hunnam did portray Percy Fawcett in the eponymous named film The Lost City of Z, or The Lost City of Zed, to go off of the British way of saying Z. Charlie Hunnam portrayed the role very well, and you got a good idea of the struggles that Percy Fawcett endured when he was exploring the Amazon. I know, I just have to be patient. I'm sure Cosmo Jarvis will do the character justice. I've seen that look before, though. Ah, yes, there we are. Yes, the Gaius Baltar look. Well, and anyway, back on topic. So Percy Fawcett, a British gentleman explorer who had originally been sent to South America in 1906 as part of a surveying expedition to determine the boundary between Brazil and Bolivia. And one of his guides had given him indications of the possibility of the existence of a lost civilization in South America. And we're told that Percy Fawcett returned numerous times. In fact, he conducted a total of 7 expeditions to South America, attempting to locate what he believed was a great lost civilization. Now, it should be noted that Percy Fawcett was acting on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society. Sounds very similar to the National Geographical Society, but irrelevant overall.
Isn't this an interesting image of him, and what a fascinating uniform at that time frame? I've never ceased to be amazed by the types of uniforms that they seem to have available in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Regardless of whatever the reason for it. Oh, look, we have an autograph here. There's something about this that almost gives us the feeling of a trading card. Get your Percy Fawcett trading card, and I'll meet you at dinner, and we can exchange trading cards with signatures on them. Very interesting, and it goes back to the time frame that these individuals were considered heroes. And here we have James Murray, a polar explorer and biologist who was born in Scotland, and he had actually joined Percy Fawcett for one of his expeditions to the Amazon to locate the lost city of Z, or the lost city of Zed. Although, unfortunately for Mr. Murray, he was not acclimated to the extreme conditions of the Amazon. And while he may have been the individual who discovered the Great Tardigrade, which is a mainstay in science fiction stories to this day, oddly enough, he was not suited for the difficult challenges of exploring the Amazon, and struggled greatly. As a result, he did not continue the expedition, and Percy Fawcett had to devote resources to save his life. Here's an image of the tardigrade, the indestructible life form that science continues to champion to this day. Very interesting life form, and something that we're told that James Murray had discovered in his journeys to the Antarctic prior to join Percy Fawcett's expedition to South America in 1911 to locate the lost city of Z. These images are always fascinating. Another thing I find interesting is we have to keep in mind that it was during this exact same time frame, 1911, that while they were doing these explorations in exotic locations, that our civilization was capable of building Bowart's buildings. And indeed, 1911 is when we think about the Great Union Station being constructed in Kansas City, or that time frame. As we said earlier, James Murray was not prepared for the difficult conditions in the Amazon, and if you're not acclimated to operate in a rainforest with heavy rainfall and extreme difficulty, then it's not going to go too well. We know, or at least we're told, that Percy Fawcett had conducted numerous expeditions, and he was prepared. He even had a story about shooting a giant anaconda on one of these expeditions, an anaconda that he said was over 50 feet long. Now, of course, scientists dismiss this claim as totally absurd because he was probably just letting his imagination run wild with him, and no one had ever seen a snake that long. Although I have to say that even to this day, a standard length anaconda is a very intimidating customer, especially if you're not used to seeing snakes. And it has a way of getting your attention if you're on a boat in the Amazon River. Something else you may not be aware of the Amazon River, it does not have any bridges across it. And there's a variety of engineering explanations for this. Back to the topic of snakes, though. The exotic locations and the challenges of running into snakes, piranhas, and all the other difficulties certainly leads the imagination to go wild. And yet at the same time, Percy Fawcett was a British Army officer. Was his account true? There continue to be lingering accounts of much larger snakes all over, not just in the Amazon. Here we have the famous picture from the Congo of a snake that I recall they originally said the snake was up to 200 feet long, but now if you look in some of the accounts, they say it was only 50 feet long. So, not really sure what to make of it, and this image has been scrutinized from many different aspects, and like any other image, it's inconclusive. But scientists do tell us that in the distant past, there was the existence of the Titanoboa, a snake that was 50 to 60 feet long, depending on which accounts that you look at. And I always find it interesting that when we have enough time in the distant past, we can find fossils that will give us indication that these giant animals once resided and across the land. But let's be very clear here, it was only animals that could get very large. Human beings, we're told by mainstream scientists, could never get large. And here you can see one of the examples of the fossilized remnants of this Titanoboa, and why you could see that a simple bone like this, you could determine that this was a Titanoboa, or a giant snake. And indeed, here it is compared to the vertebrae or bone structure of an anaconda. But as always, come to your own conclusions, because this is all we have. We have some bones that we've pulled out of fossilized remains, and somehow we've managed to make the determination that there were once large life forms. I always find it interesting, though, that when we have accounts in a certain area, and this is where you'll find these fossils, it's always in some sort of coal mine somewhere, that there always seems to be some logical scientific explanation. It usually involves a large number of years passing, and it involves a lot of research, and the indication that, yes, there was once a giant animal. It is not now, though. Any assertions that these animals exist in the present, this is absurd. And you can see how the Titanoboa compares to a standard-sized human being on the top of this little diagram here. Of course, it was not absurd if you go back into the distant past, millions of years ago. That's always the explanation, isn't it? And yet there are far too many accounts that we have from the present to include from the reliable Percy Fawcett, at least someone we're told is reliable, of encountering large snakes, and there continue to be tales of great snakes that roam the Amazon. And it doesn't seem to be too far-fetched because, as we've said, it's a very dense rainforest and there are many places to hide. And indeed, if an actual civilization could be hidden in there, well then why not larger animals? We have many different maps of the different explorations that Percy Fawcett went on and what areas that he actually explored. It should be noted that there are no shortages of wondrous and exotic ruins and sites across all of South America. It's a very intriguing place, and our explorations will be taking us there to look at both the cities and some of the rest of these sites. But again, I go back to the original question. What was the real intention behind these explorations? Are we to take it at face value that Percy Fawcett simply wanted to locate this lost civilization and made it his life's mission? And indeed, in the film The Lost City of Z, or The Lost City of Zed, that's exactly what the plot tells us. And when you've got Edward as your backup, nothing's going to happen, and it should be noted that Percy Fawcett managed to conduct 6 expeditions and return from them safely, despite all the dangers of running into indigenous people who had never had contact with other civilizations or people, or so we're told. And we're also wondering exactly what transpired. Now, finally, on his 7th expedition, Percy Fawcett did disappear with his son and his son's best friend. And many people flocked to his rescue. Ah, yes. Look at this early article from our friends at the Washington Post. Can you imagine such wording appearing in a modern article? No, I can't either. But it's intriguing to think of the fact that all these efforts were expended to try to rescue Fawcett. Now, what was really going on here? What was this civilization that he was actually looking for? We're told that the civilization was indeed located, and very recently, thanks to the use of modern technology such as LiDAR, they've been able to determine that there were numerous remnants of civilizations that were very advanced in the Amazon. Now, it's really not that surprising, but it's interesting, especially if you watch the film and then you look at some other scientific papers as to how Percy Fawcett was derided for having the opinion or the theory of there actually being a lost civilization there. And yet at the same time, a lot of the images that we have, whether it's the LiDAR scans or the so-called aerial imagery or satellite imagery, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't exactly fulfill some of the tremendous expectations that we had of finding that civilization. So I'm really wondering, are we actually seeing anything, or is this just something that's released to us to assuage our curiosity, to simply answer the question, yes, there was a civilization there, it's hidden deep under the foliage, and this is all that remains of it. Some very interesting grid patterns. Although I suspect there may be other explanations behind this expedition, and it should be noted that in academic circles there's still a lot of debate about the veracity of Percy Fawcett's expedition. And indeed, when you include the individual, the biologist and the explorer James Murray, who joined his expedition in 1911, the story becomes much more interesting. And I intend to posit that perhaps they were looking for some remnants of a previous civilization. Now, could there have been other remnants of the Fourth Era civilization that had not been located yet? Perhaps an enclave of people that they were attempting to locate? As we've posited here, the civilization that we refer to as Tartaria, but it was never referred to as Tartaria by its own people. It's just a term that we've associated with it for understanding. We do have very advanced ruins and structures all across the land in many other locations. And because of that, it doesn't seem to be a far-fetched notion at all that there could be a great remaining civilization somewhere in the Amazon. And of course, we're just supposed to take the LiDAR scans and the broad handwave explanation that yes, there was a civilization there in distant past, but there's nothing too elaborate from it, and there's really no reason to go back down there. It's not really a place that you want to be in anyway, because it's a very extreme environment. And unless you live there and you're acclimated to it, much as if you're someone who lives in a desert and you're acclimated to it, you don't really have any reason to want to go there. The other thing I always find interesting is all these conclusions are made by scientists and historians who've never actually stepped foot in many of these places. One thing I'll say for Percy Fawcett, if he did exist exactly as we're told and his account is somewhat accurate, he was at least someone who was willing to go there, repeatedly. But imagine if there was some other objective behind these explorations, that he was attempting to locate some remnants of a previous civilization. Or perhaps an even more exotic theory on my part is maybe he was looking for remnants of an even earlier civilization, an earlier era that preceded the era that came directly before ours. Or perhaps there were even rumors, or he had access to some esoteric knowledge to where there could have been greater capabilities located in this civilization. It's quite interesting that he essentially devoted his entire life to it. And keep in mind, this is an individual who had served in the rigors and the horrors of trench warfare in World War I. And even after all that, he still returned to the Amazon, convinced that there was something there to be found. Now, is this just simply on his own inclination? And yet when we look at the official account, we're told that he had a lot of supporters. He had financial support. If you're just a mid-ranking army officer, you're not going to pack up and go on an expedition to South America just for the fun of it. And you can see in these images here how civilizations have changed. And again, here are some of the images that we have that show us that yes, the mainstream acknowledges that there was an advanced civilization down there. But once again, I do wonder, are we actually seeing what's really down there? Or are we simply being given something that's to deride our curiosity and simply cause us to stop asking questions? This is an impressive site, however you look at it, but we're well aware of the fact that there are many other more impressive sites across South America, and we're going to explore them as we go forward. I don't think there's any doubt that there was great civilizations in South America, and they can be seen in the current cities there, and they can be seen in many other locations. But perhaps there was something even more exotic and even more alluring that somebody wanted to locate that may still be there somewhere. Or perhaps it has been located and it's been pulled down, torn down, or concealed. Imagine if you had some remnants of an earlier era civilization that were more advanced. And indeed, when Percy Fawcett had suggested this to the Royal Geographical Society, it was not well received. And you can see it in the movie as well, although historians will tell you that the movie The Lost City of Zed was not a very accurate movie. Although then they're the same historians that'll tell you that, yes, these accounts are well documented and you should believe everything they say. There's many mysteries across South America and many indications that there are layered civilizations there. And indeed, we're even told by the mainstream that there are civilizations that are built on top of previous civilizations. So again, it goes down to that hypocrisy, the contradiction of the fact that because you don't simply embrace what you're told initially, and you believe there may be different alterations of the explanation, you should be derided, you should be castigated, and you should not think except for that which you are told to think. That tends to be how things work in academic circles, and it's just the natural order of things, so don't ask questions, and when the experts tell you what the conclusions are, you accept them. One thing that I find quite enticing, though, about the account of Major, subsequently Colonel, Percy Fawcett, is his relentless desire to try to locate this civilization. It seems like this was an individual on a mission, and there's something similar about his dedication to finding something. We're also supposed to believe that Admiral Richard Byrd repeatedly returned to the edge of the world trying to find something, and he seemed to be the only individual capable of doing it. Same thing can be said for Percy Fawcett. He was in his late 50s when he embarked on his last expedition to the Amazon, on which he disappeared. We're also supposed to believe that someone who was this experienced and had completed 6 previous expeditions had just suddenly disappeared. Now, yes, unfortunate events can happen, but this seemed to be someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't James Murray going back down there after his polar expedition expecting to have success, and then he just was overcome by the environment there. There's even the legends of blemmies, and we're told that this was the overall perspective of what may be found in the Amazon in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Very intriguing. Now, of course, this can easily be dismissed, and yet at the same time, we do have people there that haven't had much, if any, contact with modern individuals. And so the allure of the civilization that may be there, and is still there, is something that we need to explore and find. And we mustn't forget that many of the remnants of previous civilizations are all around us. You don't have to go to an exotic location such as the Amazon. But it seems to me that there was something that was really there. And looking at our 5 eras theory timeline, the search for the lost city of Z or the lost city of Zed is something that comes from the contemporary era, the age of exploration, where there's no doubt that once the reset conflict was complete at the end of the 1850s or the 1880s or whatever the timeline really was, that whatever remained of the previous civilization had to be located and erased once and for all. And there seems to be the focus of exploration that continued even up to the early 1900s, that was its main objective. But what was the remains of this civilization that they were looking for in Amazon? Was this something from the Fourth Era? Some elaborate wreckage or some elaborate ruins that may have had some technology that they were looking for? Or was this something from the Second or Third Era? Perhaps even the remnants of a civilization that had even greater technology or capabilities. And that would explain the focus of Percy Fawcett. What are your thoughts? So I wanted to consider the account of James Murray, and this is from the Linda Hall Library from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. The account of James Murray is intriguing as well, and I also want to evaluate what the current thoughts of the day are of James Murray from the official academic perspective. I also want to question the academic perspective a little bit because, I can't do it in an exploration without questioning the academic perspective. So we're told by this particular article that the scientist of the day, James Murray, was known for discovering the tardigrade. And if you're interested in the tardigrade, I'll attach a link on the video and you can take a look at it. It's a very intriguing life form officially, and that's what James Murray is known for. We also look in this and we see how this particular author regards the depiction of James Murray, or should I say the portrayal of him, in the film The Lost City of Zed. And there he is being saved by Edward himself from Twilight. And it should be noted that James Murray was portrayed by Angus MacFadyen, most famous for playing Robert the Bruce in Braveheart and in the eponymous movie that followed later. Did a very good job in my humble opinion. In any event, we're told that the most notorious adventure undertaken by Murray came in 1911 when he agreed to accompany Percy Fawcett. Now, what I'll summarize for you is that what the historian here tells us is that Murray was actually not as he was depicted in the film, even though the official account does say that Murray had great difficulty on the expedition that was depicted in the film. For some reason, we're supposed to go off of this historian's account that that's not actually what happened. And it says this: none of this really happened. Of the two men, Fawcett was far crazier and more egotistical than Murray, and even less competent, or so it is said by some historians. Now, why am I highlighting this? Right here. Or so it is said by some historians. So it's clear that the author of this article is not even certain and can't even highlight direct sources. Or the point I'm making here is that even going back to a time frame not so far ago as the early 1900s, we have what I like to call our conflicting accounts. And to this author's credit, this is a conflicting account. Is this really what happened? Or is there something else that happened? The only way to know for sure is if you actually accompanied the expedition in 1911. And the expedition wasn't that large, only a couple individuals. So who really knows? Now, what ended up happening to Mr. Murray? Well, he subsequently disappeared on another expedition, this time to the Arctic Ocean. So I don't see how you could consider him more proficient than Fawcett, as they both ended up the same way, that they disappeared on expeditions. And indeed, this author seems to lament the fact that Murray doesn't even have a tombstone, so we know what he finds valuable. Now you may be asking, why exactly should this author be the final authority on what actually happened to events that he did not personally witness, in which all he had available were conflicting accounts? Well, I'll tell you. This is Dr. William B. Ashworth, Jr., Consultant for the History of Science, Linda Hall Library. So just keep that in mind. When you are a historian or a scientist, you have total authority. You have more authority than the Inquisition did to actually state what happened. And we better believe what we're told here. And that's why the title's important, Dr. William B. Ashworth. Imagine if we had a scientist of history instead of a historian of scientists. Get it? In any event, I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think of this in the comments.
I'd love to stay, but